She was 22 and shut out. No house key. No winter coat. No place that would say her name. Just a cracked leather tool roll and $2 she had kept folded inside an old pewter spoon case. And with that money, she bought a collapsed Pewtersmith's forge near the abandoned Concord Junction freight spur in Middlesex County, Massachusetts, a name that fell off railroad maps in 1927. The brick chimney was broken halfway down. One wall leaned outward with daylight showing through. The county had condemned it since 1989 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the largest casting mold on the rear bench, in a sealed steel chamber that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Nora Ellery Vale had been apprenticing her whole life without knowing it. By 10 years old, she had learned to stand far enough back from molten metal to respect its hunger, yet close enough to see the surface change when it was ready. Her father called that shine the bright skin. It came just before the pour, when the pewter stopped looking like scrap and began to look like moonlight held in a spoon. Their shed behind the house in Fitchburg was hardly a shop. It had a tin roof that chattered under sleet, a floor darkened by paraffin and stove ash, and a row of coffee cans labeled in her father's careful block letters. Tin. Antimony. Copper. Buttons. Scrap hinges. Broken handles. The labels had mattered to him. Everything with a name could be handled correctly. He used to say, and anything handled correctly might yet be saved. Nora had been a quiet child, not shy in the tender way people like to imagine, but inward, guarded, exact. She could sit for an hour rubbing a spoon bowl with rotten stone and oil until a dull gray surface lifted into a soft luster. At school, other children brought bright plastic lunchboxes and stories from vacations. Nora brought sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and the faint scent of metal in the seams of her sleeves. Her father never apologized for the smell. He would lift her wrist gently after supper and turn her hand palm up beneath the kitchen light, checking for burns the way another man might check a garden for frost. Good hands, he would say. She did not know then how much a child could live on 2 words. Her mother had died before Nora remembered the sound of her voice. What remained of her lived in shallow things, a blue glass hairpin in a drawer, 3 recipe cards written in a narrow hand, a photograph of a woman standing beside a maple tree with one shoulder turned against the wind. Her father kept the photograph above the stove, not in a frame, only tucked behind the clock where steam had curled its edges. He spoke of his first wife carefully, as though grief were a tool with a sharp edge and must be carried handle first. He did not make Nora into a memorial. He did not ask the child to comfort him. On winter evenings, when the house settled and the furnace clicked, he showed her how to file a sprue, clean from a casting, how to hold a ladle steady, how to test a mold seam with the pad of her thumb. When he remarried, Nora was 13, old enough to understand the rooms had changed before anyone moved a chair. Marielle came into the house with pale gloves, a narrow mouth, and a habit of looking at Nora's hands before looking at her face. She did not shout. She did not slam doors. Her cruelty had the polished surface of good manners. She would lift Nora's work apron from the chair with 2 fingers and say, "This belongs outside," then smile at Nora's father when he turned around. For a few years, the house ran on 2 kinds of silence. There was the warm silence of the shop, full of breath and concentration, where father and daughter measured, heated, poured, and waited. Then there was the cold silence of the rooms after Marielle had finished setting the table, a silence so exact that even the forks seemed worn into place. Nora learned which kind she was standing in before anyone spoke. The person who kept her from hardening all the way was her grandfather's younger brother, Alton Vale, though everyone in the family called him Uncle Al. He had no children of his own and lived on the edge of Leominster in a weathered house with a barn full of hand tools, coffee tins, wheel weights, broken candlesticks, pewter plates, and 6 generations of patient practice. Alton was not a large man. He had a stoop from leaning over benches, a white beard stained faintly yellow at the mustache from pipe smoke, and forearms roped with fine, durable strength. Every Saturday morning, Nora's father drove her there before the stores opened. In summer, she arrived with grass wet on her shoes. In winter, she carried a paper sack of biscuits wrapped in a dish towel, and the first sound she heard was the knock of Alton's cane against the barn door. "Come in slow," he would call. "Tools remember clumsy people." The ritual never changed unless snow buried the road. They began by sweeping, not because the barn was clean, but because sweeping taught the eyes to notice. Metal filings near a vise meant somebody had cut something soft. Gray powder under the polishing wheel meant a piece had been rushed. A dropped nail could tell a story if a person was not too proud to bend down. After sweeping, Alton brewed coffee for himself and hot milk for Nora in a dented saucepan. They sat beside the little stove until the windows cleared. Then he opened the cabinets. Those cabinets held the world. There were soapstone molds for buttons, brass patterns for spoon handles, maple forms dark with oil, slender files wrapped in cloth, ladles with lips worn thin from pouring, and burnishers polished by palms long dead. Alton knew the history of each piece, not in a showy way, but as a farmer knows fields. This one came from Worcester. This one was traded after a barn fire in Acton. This one belonged to a woman who poured communion cups during the war and never signed her name to a single one. He taught Nora not only how to cast, but how to wait. Pewter did not forgive haste. Too cold, and it folded into dull seams. Too hot, and it grew brittle, losing its honest body. The mold had to be warmed, smoked, clamped, and listened to. The pour had to be deliberate. The cooling had to be respected. By 14, Nora could make a spoon plain enough to disappear on a breakfast table, which Alton called a high compliment. By 16, she could repair a tankard handle without leaving a scar, unless someone knew where to look. By 18, she understood that polishing was not decoration. It was the final act of attention. Some Saturdays, Alton took out the family patterns. They were not valuable in any market Nora understood then, but he handled them like bread. A flowered spoon stem, a porringer ear shaped like a fiddle head, a candlestick base with a faint hammered border. He told her the Vale family had come through metal, not money, and that money wandered off when frightened. Metal stayed. One November morning, with rain dragging down the barn windows and the stove refusing to draw, Alton set a flawed spoon in front of her. It had cooled with a slight depression near the bowl, hardly visible unless the light was low. Nora reached for the scrap bucket, but Alton caught her wrist. "Never throw away what only needs a patient hand." He said it plainly, without softness, and went back to sorting files. For years after, the sentence stayed with her in ways she did not understand. It meant the spoon, of course. It meant a dent could be lifted, a seam could be chased, a surface could be brought back. But underneath that, in the place where a child stores the few instructions that may save her, it meant that damage was not the same as worthlessness. It meant some things must be held longer than the world is willing to hold them. Alton died in February, when the gutters were frozen and the roads were white with salt. He had been found beside his bench with one hand resting on a polishing cloth, as if he had only paused to listen for something. Nora's father came home from the hospital with his cap in both hands. He did not cry in the kitchen. He only stood by the sink and looked out at the iced lilac bush until Nora touched his elbow. They buried Alton under a sky the color of pewter before it shines. After the funeral, the barn was supposed to be sorted with care. Her father said the tools would come to Nora when she had a shop of her own. He said Alton had meant it that way. He said there were molds in the cabinets older than the house itself, records in cigar boxes, patterns wrapped in flour sacks, and a ledger with names reaching back to the 18th century. But grief makes a household slow, and Marielle was not slow. Within 2 weeks, a dealer from out of town had come with a van and a clipboard. Nora arrived after school to find the barn door open and the cabinet stripped bare. The soapstone molds were gone. The brass patterns were gone. Alton's ladles, his files, his burnishers, his little stove with the mica window, all gone into cardboard and moving blankets. Marielle stood in the yard wearing her pale gloves. "Old metal brings better prices before spring," she said. Nora's father did not speak. He was sitting on the back steps with sawdust on his shoes, looking older than he had looked the week before. Only one thing remained by accident or mercy. A cracked leather tool roll had fallen behind the feed bin, where dust and mouse droppings hid it from the dealer's quick inventory. Inside were 3 files, a small scraper, a narrow spoon stake, a pair of dividers, a half-round burnisher, and Alton's awl with its handle blackened by use. Nora kept the roll under her mattress. Not hidden exactly. Kept. Her father died 4 years later, on an afternoon of hard rain. He had been repairing a gutter for a neighbor because the mill had cut his hours again, and his heart, which had borne too much without complaint, simply stopped on the ladder. By then Nora was 22. She had been cleaning rooms at a motel, taking weekend shifts at a bakery, and doing small metal repairs for people who still remembered her father's hands. The funeral was modest and damp. The church carpet smelled of lilies and wet wool. Men from the mill stood in the back with their caps folded against their stomachs. A woman Nora did not know touched her sleeve and said her father had once mended a baptismal cup for free. Nora nodded because speech had become too large a thing to lift. Marielle sat in the front pew with her black hat pinned perfectly straight. That was the thing about her. Nothing about her ever appeared broken. She could stand beside a coffin with the posture of a person waiting at a bank window. She accepted condolences with a lowered gaze. She dabbed once at each eye. She let Nora stand beside her as if they were joined by sorrow, and all the while Nora could see the smooth, deliberate working of her mind. By 4 o'clock that same afternoon, the locks had been changed. Nora came back from the church basement carrying a covered dish someone had pressed into her hands. The rain had eased into a fine, cold mist. On the front lawn, beneath the maple tree where her mother had once been photographed, her clothes lay in dark heaps. A cardboard box had split open near the walk. Her winter boots were tipped sideways in the grass. Her father's work shirts, still smelling faintly of soap and iron, had been folded and then dropped where mud could climb them. The cracked leather tool roll lay on top of the box. Nora set the covered dish on the porch rail and tried the door. The new keyhole shone brass and stranger bright. Marielle opened the door only as wide as the chain allowed. Behind her, Nora saw the hall light burning, her father's coat still hanging from the peg, and the corner of the kitchen table where he had sharpened pencils with a pocket knife every Sunday night. "This house is mine. You are not needed here." 8 words, spoken evenly, with no lifted voice. Nora looked past her to the woman who had eaten at her father's table, worn his name, received his care through winters of illness and summers of tight money. Marielle's face remained composed. She did not look away. That was the betrayal Nora remembered most clearly afterward. Not the boxes or the rain or the new lock. It was the absence of even one flinch. The chain slid back into place. The door closed with a soft, careful sound. Nora stood on the porch until the mist had dampened her hair against her cheeks. Then she picked up the tool roll, 2 shirts, 1 pair of boots, and the spoon case where she kept the $2 from Alton's final Christmas card. She left the rest because carrying has its own laws. A person can only take what her arms agree to hold. For 6 weeks, she moved through Massachusetts like a piece of scrap passed from hand to hand. The first night she slept in the Fitchburg bus station, sitting upright beneath a humming light while a vending machine clicked to itself. Her money then was $31.46, counting the coins in her coat pocket and the bills she had folded behind her library card. She bought coffee at dawn because it was cheaper than food and warmer than pride. By the 3rd day, she was in Worcester, where the sidewalks were crusted white and the wind moved between buildings like water through a broken mold. She slept 2 nights in a shelter on Queen Street, lying on a cot with her boots tucked beneath her knees and the leather tool roll inside her coat. A volunteer with red hands gave her a peanut butter sandwich and a list of agencies printed on blue paper. Nora thanked her, folded the paper twice, and carried it until rain softened the ink. In Framingham, she slept behind a laundromat where the dryer vents breathed warm air into the alley. Her money had diminished to $18.09. She washed 1 shirt in a restroom sink and wore it wet beneath her sweater. She learned which gas stations let a person stand inside for 10 minutes before asking a question. She learned how hunger sharpened smell, how bread inside a paper bag could make the whole body turn toward it. In Waltham, a night clerk at an all-night pharmacy let her sit near the blood pressure machine until morning, provided she did not sleep openly. Nora held a magazine in her hands and read the same paragraph for 3 hours, lifting her eyes whenever the clerk looked over. Her tool roll rested under her feet. A man buying cough syrup asked if she was waiting for someone. She said yes, because the lie was smaller than the truth. By the 5th week, she had reached Cambridge, though she could not have said why, except that buses went there and libraries stayed open. She slept one night under the stone steps of a church near Harvard Square, wrapped in a discarded moving blanket that smelled of basement dust. Students passed laughing under umbrellas. A bell counted the hour with formal indifference. Her money was down to $4.72. She did not call Marielle. She did not go back to the house. She did not write a letter or ask after furniture or demand her father's shirts. There was no noble decision in it. There was only a door closed so completely that even knocking seemed like giving it power. Instead, she kept moving in small, careful ways. A day labor office gave her 6 hours unloading boxes in Somerville, paid cash, and did not ask where she would sleep. A church kitchen in Medford served soup with barley in it. A librarian in Lexington let her stay at a table near the radiator after noticing Nora's hands tremble over a newspaper. The library was where she found the advertisement. It was not in the bright part of the building where children whispered over picture books and older men read the Globe. It was downstairs, near the local history shelves, where the air smelled of paper, radiator heat, and floor wax. Nora had gone there to warm herself and to look through job listings, though by then the word experience had begun to feel like a locked gate. The classified page had been folded wrong. Someone had circled a used snowblower in blue ink, and beneath that, nearly lost between estate notices and municipal surplus, was a boxed announcement no wider than her palm. Middlesex County property disposed. Former Pewtersmith forge and attached cottage. Concord, Massachusetts. Condemned structure. No utilities. No warranty. Purchaser assumes all risk. Taxes. Removal responsibility. Minimum bid $2. Inquire County Clerk. East Cambridge office. She read it once with the dull attention a hungry person gives to anything printed. Then the word Pewtersmith rose from the paper like heat. Nora placed one finger beneath the line and read again. Former Pewtersmith forge. The letters were ordinary. The paper was cheap. Around her, the library continued its settled breathing. Pages turning, boots squeaking faintly on tile, the radiator ticking through its metal ribs. Yet something in her body grew still with the exactness she had known before a pour. She copied the address onto the back of the blue agency list. Then she checked the date twice. The bids closed the next morning at 10. For a long while, she sat without moving. Outside the narrow basement window, snowmelt slid from the curb in gray threads. A person at another table coughed into a sleeve. Somewhere overhead, a child laughed and was hushed. Nora took the spoon case from her coat pocket. The hinge was loose. Inside lay the $2, folded into a square so often that the paper felt almost like cloth. Alton had given it to her when she was 17, tucked inside a Christmas card that smelled faintly of pipe tobacco. She had never spent it because it was too little to matter and too dear to lose. Now it had become an amount exact enough to open a door. That night, she slept in the Lexington Library's outer entry until a custodian found her before dawn. He was a broad man with silver hair and a careful face. He did not raise his voice. He only unlocked the inner door, looked at the tool roll clutched beneath her arm, and said, "Bus runs east at 6:12. Then he handed her a paper cup of coffee from his thermos. She rode standing for part of the way because commuters filled the seats, their shoulders damp from morning weather, their faces turned toward windows or phones or the private arithmetic of their own lives. At Alewife, she counted coins into a machine with fingers gone stiff from cold. By the time she reached East Cambridge, she had the two folded dollars, 3 quarters, 1 dime, and a nickel. Enough for the bid. Not enough for certainty. The county building stood square and indifferent beneath a low sky. Nora paused on the sidewalk before going in. Not because she was afraid of the clerk or the paperwork, but because she understood that a person can cross from one life into another through a very plain door. The hinge will not announce it. The floor will not tremble. No one passing by will turn to witness. She entered with her father's files wrapped in cracked leather under her arm, Alton's $2 in her coat pocket, and nowhere left to return to. By the next evening, she would be walking alone toward a condemned forge with a broken chimney, a deed folded against her ribs, and the first cold outline of a home she had not yet learned how to trust. The first clerk she met sent her west before she had even removed her gloves. He sat behind a pane of cloudy glass in the East Cambridge office, with stacks of folders on both sides of him and a small electric heater pointed at his shoes. He read the advertisement, looked once at her coat, once at the cracked leather roll under her arm, and slid the paper back as though it had acquired weight from being touched. "County keeps the notice," he said. "Town holds the transfer. Concord clerk by 10 if you want your bid recorded." He did not say whether a person who looked like her should want such a thing. By then the morning had become a pale stripe above the roofs. She walked to the bus stop with her hands closed inside her sleeves, carrying her life in the careful manner of someone moving a full cup through a crowded room. The bus that came was warm enough to fog the windows, and she stood near the rear door while office workers leaned against poles and watched the city pass without seeing it. Past Porter Square, the houses grew lower and the sky wider. Past Arlington, bare branches rubbed against a colorless morning. In Lexington, the driver told her the route she needed was delayed, then canceled, then maybe running from Bedford if the road crew cleared the shoulder. He said all of this with the tired patience of a man who had given the same answer too many times. She counted her coins on the bench. There were not enough for guessing wrong. So she walked. The road west carried the kind of winter that does not look dramatic from behind glass. It was not deep snow, not a storm a person could point to and blame, but the slower punishment of frozen ruts, dirty banks, and a wind that found every opening in her clothing. She followed Massachusetts Avenue until the sidewalks thinned, then took the shoulder where cars passed with their tires hissing through slush. A woman in a station wagon slowed once, looked at the tool roll beneath Nora's arm, and kept going. By late afternoon, the light had lowered behind the trees and her legs had become two separate aches. She had walked 8.5 miles by the numbers on the road signs, and perhaps twice that by the measure of her feet. At a farm lane outside Lincoln, she saw a hay barn with one sliding door open just enough for weather and the smell of animals to pass through. She waited until no one came down the lane. Then she crossed the crusted yard and slipped inside. The barn held stacked hay bales, a rusted cultivator, 3 feed barrels, and the warm, dry scent of stored summer. Wind pressed at the boards but did not enter fully. She climbed behind the second stack and made a hollow for herself between bales, placing the leather roll under her head and her boots inside her coat so she would feel them if anyone tried to take them. At dusk, a radio in the farmhouse kitchen carried faintly across the yard when someone opened a door. The announcer gave road reports and said the temperature had fallen to 23 degrees. She ate half a roll saved from a church kitchen and drank melted snow from her palm after holding it near her body. It tasted of dust from her glove. Before sleeping, she took out the spoon case, not to count what remained but to feel the hinge under her thumb. The metal had a little give in it, a familiar fault. The night was long and not quite silent. Mice worked in the walls. A horse shifted somewhere beyond a partition. Once a truck moved along the road, and its headlights slid through the barn boards in narrow, passing bars. She did not dream. Her body had no room for dreams. At first light, she left the barn as she had found it, except for the slight depression where she had slept and 3 strands of hay caught in her hair. Concord appeared not all at once but in fragments, each one more settled than the last. A white church steeple rose above winter trees. Brick sidewalks held shallow crusts of ice at the edges. The town common opened in a careful square, with benches unoccupied and monuments standing among bare branches. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, damp wool, and the exhaust of idling delivery trucks. She passed the Concord bookshop, its windows arranged with hardcovers and handwritten cards. Main Street's Market and Cafe had yellow light in the glass and a chalkboard menu turned toward the sidewalk. A florist called the Green Bee had buckets of cut branches outside despite the cold, red dogwood stems standing like thin flames. At Merrimack Savings, a man in a dark coat unlocked the front door and shook salt from a mat. Beside a narrow alley, Vanderhoof Hardware displayed snow shovels, brass hinges, lamp wicks, and 3 sizes of stovepipe elbow. She stopped before the hardware window longer than she meant to. There were files inside. Not fine ones. Not hand-worn, not the kind Alton would have chosen first, but files with teeth and handles and a purpose. There was a claw hammer with a hickory grip. There were cotton work gloves. There was a can of black stove polish with a paper label showing a shining cook stove and a woman smiling at it as if polish could make a house whole. Nora put one hand against her pocket where the spoon case rested, then lowered it. The town offices occupied a brick building off Monument Square. Plain and clean, with a flag moving stiffly on a pole out front. Inside, the hallway smelled of varnish, wet coats, and paper warmed by radiators. A directory board listed Conservation Commission, assessors, treasurer, town clerk, building department. Each name sat behind black plastic letters pressed into white grooves, exact and official. She climbed the stairs because the elevator had a sign taped to it saying out of service. The clerk's office door was half open. Beyond it, 2 women worked at desks beneath fluorescent lights. One typed with 2 fingers. The other stood at a file cabinet, pulling manila folders from a drawer with the steady motion of someone who had outlasted many questions. On the counter sat a brass bell, a jar of pencils, and a little wooden sign that read, "Please wait to be called." Nora waited. The woman at the cabinet turned first. She was in her late 60s, perhaps older, with silver hair cut blunt at her jaw and a sweater the color of oatmeal. Her glasses hung from a chain shaped like tiny gold leaves. The nameplate on her desk read Eleanor M. Hatch, Town Clerk. Behind her, a wall calendar showed a photograph of the North Bridge in autumn, though the month itself was February. Mrs. Hatch looked at Nora's coat, her boots, the leather roll under her arm, and then the folded advertisement laid on the counter. Her face did not soften. That mattered. Softness, Nora had learned, often came before pity. "You came about the forge." "Yes." "Mom." "Mrs." Hatch took the advertisement and tapped it once on the counter to straighten its edge. "You understand this is a condemned building?" "Yes." "Mom." "You understand there is no electricity?" "Yes." "Mom." "No town water?" "Yes." "Mom." "No heat certified for use?" "Yes." "Mom." "The rear wall has been marked unsafe by the inspector?" "Yes." "Mom." "The county has no obligation to repair." "Insure." "Clear." "Board." "Drain." "Pump." "Shore." "Heat." "Guard," or otherwise preserve the property once transferred. Nora held her hand still on the counter. "Yes." "Mom." "Mrs." Hatch watched her for a few seconds. The typing at the other desk stopped, then resumed more quietly. "You understand," the clerk said, and this time the words were slower, "that people have bought properties like this because a number looked small on paper, then lost more than they could carry trying to make the paper real." Nora looked down at the advertisement. The boxed notice had begun to soften at the creases from being folded and unfolded through weather. "Yes." "Mom." "Mrs." Hatch removed her glasses and polished them with a cloth from her sleeve. "I am required to tell you that the town would rather demolish it. The parcel is an irritation. The building draws teenagers, raccoons, rainwater, and correspondence. No one has operated a trade there in living memory." The other woman at the desk made a small sound that might have been agreement. Nora said nothing. "The bid is not refundable." "Yes." "Mom." "The back taxes are waived under the disposal order, but current taxes begin after transfer." "Yes." "Mom." "There is a lien release packet. You will need to sign every page." "Yes." "Mom." "Mrs." Hatch studied her once more, and at last some private decision moved behind her eyes. She opened a drawer, removed a blue folder, and laid the contents on the counter. The papers had already been stamped with file numbers. A map of the parcel showed a narrow rectangle beside an abandoned rail easement with a square-marked structure and a dotted line leading to what had once been an outbuilding. Nora gave it. The clerk's pen stopped above the form. She looked up slowly. Vale. Nora's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter, but she did not answer. The surname had been spoken by officials before, usually as a way of locating a fee or a debt or a room key. Mrs. Hatch said it differently, not fondly, not even warmly, but as if it had opened a drawer in her memory. Any relation to the pewter man who worked out by Leominster? Nora's throat moved once. He taught me some. More than some, I would imagine, Mrs. Hatch set the pen down and leaned back in her chair. My husband had a christening cup repaired by him. That would have been 40 years ago. The handle was cracked clean through. He sent it back wrapped in newspaper, polished only where the repair required it. He wrote a note saying the dents belonged to the family and should be left alone. The room seemed to narrow around the counter. Nora could see the barn again. Rain on the windows. A stove that would not draw. A flawed spoon held between two fingers. She looked at the pencils in the jar because the clerk's face had become difficult to look at directly. Mrs. Hatch put her glasses back on. He was careful, she said. Yes. Mom. The clerk nodded once, as though that answer had satisfied something unrelated to the sale. Then she turned the first page around and pointed to a line. Sign here. Full legal name. Nora signed. Her handwriting looked too thin on the page. She signed again below the lien release, again below the hazard acknowledgement, again beneath a paragraph concerning lead paint, asbestos, falling masonry, concealed wells, cellar collapse, an unauthorized entry. The words accumulated like snow against a door. Mrs. Hatch did not hurry her. She slid each page forward, waited, turned it, and laid the next one square. When the folded bills came out of the spoon case, the other woman at the desk looked away. Mrs. Hatch did not. She accepted them, smoothed them with her palm, and placed them in the cash drawer as if they were no different from a check for a marriage license or a fee for a birth certificate. Then she drew the deed toward herself, aligned it beneath the brass stamp at the corner of the counter, and pulled the handle down. The stamp made a solid sound. Not loud. Final. She inked a second seal, pressed it onto the transfer copy, and signed her name with a slow downward stroke. Then she slid the deed into a county envelope, added a photocopied map, and opened a side drawer. From it she took a key ring with 3 keys on it. 2 were bright hardware store copies. One was darker and heavier, with a round bow and a shaft worn almost smooth. A paper tag attached by string read pewter forge. Rear door. Maybe. Mrs. Hatch read the tag and gave a dry breath that was not quite a laugh. Do not trust the word maybe. No. Mom. The front door is swollen. Rear door sometimes opens if you lift before turning. If it does not, there is a loose board below the north window. The inspector found it and pretended not to. Nora placed the keys beside the envelope. The clerk turned the map and marked it with a pencil. From here, take Main Street west until it bends. You will cross near the library, then continue toward Old Marlborough Road. At the stone wall with the broken granite post, turn right onto the lane. It has no town sign now. Walnut trees on both sides. If you reach the Assabet Bridge, you have gone too far. She paused. Do not go inside after dark if the floor feels soft. Yes. Mom. And do not light anything until you know where the chimney is open and where the birds have nested. Yes. Mom. Mrs. Hatch hesitated, then wrote a telephone number on the bottom of the map. This is the building inspector. He will not be pleased, but he answers messages. This other number is Vanderhoof Hardware. Ask for Mr. Hiram Bell if you need stove parts, nails, lantern mantles, or advice you did not request. The other woman at the desk smiled without looking up. Nora gathered the envelope, map, and keys. The leather tool roll felt heavier when she lifted it, though nothing had been added to it. At the door, Mrs. Hatch spoke again. Nora stopped. The clerk had opened the cash drawer. The 2 folded bills lay on top of the tray, separate from the other money. Mrs. Hatch looked down at them, then closed the drawer without moving them into a compartment. A trade can sleep a long time, she said. It does not always die. Nora had no answer that would fit inside the office. Outside, the day had cleared, leaving the winter sky a hard, high blue. Sunlight struck the church steeple and the wet street, making every surface seem briefly washed. The envelope rested beneath her coat, flat against her ribs, and each step away from the clerk's office made the paper there sound faintly against her blouse. She did not buy coffee. She did not enter the cafe, though warmth breathed from the door each time someone went in. Hunger had become familiar enough to stand beside her without speaking. She spent 1 dime on a public telephone in the vestibule of the town building and called the inspector's number. No one answered. She left no message because she did not know what voice to use. Then she began walking. Main Street was busy in the middle of town, with delivery vans nosed to curbs and mothers guiding children across crosswalks by the shoulders of their coats. A golden retriever tied outside the bookshop lifted its head as she passed and thumped its tail twice against the snow. Near the market, a man carried crates of oranges through a side door, and the smell came after him, bright and almost painful. The town thinned slowly. Houses grew farther apart. The sidewalks gave way to shoulder and ditch. She passed a white house with green shutters, a barn converted to offices, a narrow cemetery behind an iron fence, and a school where children shouted on a blacktop before being called inside. At one driveway, an elderly man in a red knit cap was spreading sand from a coffee can. He watched her approach, looked at the tool roll, then nodded once. She nodded back. Beyond the last cluster of houses, Old Marlborough Road bent between stone walls and winter fields. Patches of snow lay in the shadows, but sunlight had softened the exposed ground into mud that clung to her soles. The air smelled of thawing leaves. Somewhere beyond the trees, a dog barked with the rough insistence of a farm animal announcing news to no one in particular. The walnut trees appeared exactly where Mrs. Hatch had said they would. They stood along a lane that was no longer a lane so much as a memory pressed into the earth. Their trunks were dark and furrowed, their branches bare against the sky, their fallen nuts crushed into black husks beneath the snow. The stone wall at the turning had collapsed in 3 places, and the broken granite post leaned toward the ditch as though tired of keeping watch. There was no sign at the road. Nora turned in. The lane rose slightly, curved between the walnut trees, then opened into a clearing gone pale with winter weeds. At first, she saw only the chimney. It rose from the rear of the building like a damaged finger, squared brick darkened by weather, the top portion missing so that the remaining flue ended abruptly against the sky. Crows had gathered on it and lifted away when she came close, their wings making a dry cloth sound. The forge stood low and broad on a fieldstone foundation, 28 feet across the front by perhaps 34 deep, with the attached cottage set back on the left like a shoulder drawn inward against cold. The front section was brick-laid in common bond, the mortar washed thin in places. The cottage was weathered clapboard, once white, now gray with streaks where rain had pulled tannin from the roof shingles. A roof sagged over the join between the two buildings, patched in one corner with rusted tin and in another with a square of black tar paper curling loose at the edges. 3 windows faced the lane. 2 had plywood over them. 1 had no glass at all, only strips of cloth nailed across the opening from the inside long ago and shredded now by wind. The front door was a plank door with a transom above it. The glass cracked diagonally from corner to corner. Beside the door hung the remnant of a sign on 2 iron hooks. Most of its paint had lifted away, but a few letters remained beneath lichen and weather. Repair. No name. No promise. Only the work. The yard held a collapsed privy, a pump handle frozen at an angle, a pile of brick under sumac, and the circular depression of what might once have been a turning place for wagons. Vines had climbed the south wall and died there, leaving brittle stems like handwriting across the brick. A length of gutter lay in the grass, filled with leaves. The building leaned in several directions at once, not theatrically, but with the gradual exhaustion of something asked to stand too long without help. Nora stood at the edge of the yard and listened. A freight train sounded far away, not on the abandoned spur, but somewhere beyond the modern roads, its horn flattened by distance. The air moved through the broken window and came out again with a faint hollow note. Meltwater dripped from the roof into a metal bucket someone had left decades before, each drop striking with an exact, separate sound. She crossed the yard slowly, testing the ground with each step. Near the rear, briars had woven themselves across the path, and she had to press them aside with the leather roll. The rear door was smaller than the front and painted a green so faded it had become almost the color of lichen. It had swollen in its frame. The bright key did nothing. The second bright key turned halfway and stopped. Then she tried the darker one. The key entered with reluctance. She lifted the door with her shoulder, turned the bow carefully, and felt something inside the lock shift after a long resistance. Not open fully. Agree. She pushed. The door gave inward 3 inches and stopped against something on the floor. She pushed again, harder, and heard a dry scrape. A wedge of plaster slid away from the inside. Cold air came out first, carrying the smell of dust, soot, mouse nests, wet wood, and metal so faint it seemed less smelled than remembered. The first room was the cottage kitchen, though it had surrendered most signs of use. A cast-iron stove stood against the interior wall with one lid missing and its pipe disconnected at the elbow. The sink was a porcelain basin stained brown beneath a hand pump that no longer moved. Shelves lined one wall, bowed in the middle, holding 3 jars clouded white with age, a chipped saucer, and a row of nails driven into a board for utensils that were gone. The floorboards were wide pine, uneven and ridged by wear. Near the door, one board dipped under her weight, and she stepped aside at once, remembering Mrs. Hatch's warning. Her boots left damp marks on the dusty floor. The sound of her breathing seemed too intimate in the unused room. She did not close the rear door. Not yet. The front room opened through a low doorway. It must once have served customers, if customers had come this far down the lane. A counter ran along the right wall, its top scarred by rings and knife marks. Behind it were narrow shelves, empty except for 2 paper labels curled into illegibility and 1 pewter button lying face down in dust. On the opposite wall, a small fireplace had been bricked over, the brickwork newer than the rest and poorly done. A nail above the counter held a length of string, and at the end of that string hung a wooden tag with no writing left on it. Light entered through the cracked transom and the broken front window, thin and bluish. Dust turned inside the light without hurry. Nora crossed the room and touched the counter with 2 fingers. Beneath the dust, the wood was grooved where hands had rested in the same place again and again. Customers' hands, perhaps. Workers' hands. Someone waiting for a repair. Someone paying in coins counted twice. Someone receiving back a family cup with the dents left where they belonged. The taste of the room settled on her tongue, mineral and dry. Beyond the front room, through a heavier door hanging crooked on strap hinges, was the forge. She stood at the threshold a long time before entering. The back room was colder, larger, and almost completely still. It had a brick floor laid in uneven courses, a central hearth built waist-high, and a hood above it leading to the damaged chimney. The hood was black with soot and streaked white where water had come down the flue. Along the rear wall, a workbench stretched nearly the full width of the room. It sagged in the middle but had not collapsed. On it sat shapes beneath dust cloths stiffened by years of damp. She could make out the forms of a vise, a mandrel, a rack of tongs, and several molds stacked on edge. Her hand went to the leather roll under her arm. Something in the room answered without sound. Not welcome. Not yet. Recognition. Perhaps. Though she would not have used that word. The room held the particular waiting quality of a bench left between tasks, as if whoever had stepped away from it had intended to return after supper and had been delayed by 70 winters. She moved carefully around the hearth. Broken glass clicked beneath her boot. A bird nest had fallen into one corner and dried into a cup of straw. Feather and thread. Mouse droppings lined the baseboard. Overhead, 2 rafters showed water stains, and one had split near its bearing end. She looked long enough to memorize the danger, then looked away before fear could enlarge it. There were smells layered here the way metals are layered in alloy. Soot first, then mildew, then cold brick, rust, oil gone rancid, and something sweeter, like dry cedar or the inside of an old drawer. When she touched the edge of the bench, grit clung to her fingertips. When she lifted the corner of one dust cloth, the fabric tore with a sound like paper. Beneath it lay a set of wooden patterns. Not the family ones. Not Alton's. These were larger, plainer, their surfaces darkened by time and handling. A spoon stem, a hinge plate, a shallow cup form, a border strip with a repeated leaf shape worn soft at the edges. She covered them again because looking too long felt greedy. In a side alcove, she found stairs to the loft, but the first step shifted under pressure, so she left it. Beside the stairs was a cupboard with no door. Inside were 3 clay crucibles, cracked, 2 bricks marked by heat, a tin of lamp wicks hardened into one mass, and a folded newspaper from a year whose first 3 numbers were 1, 9, and 4. She did not unfold it. The day was leaving. Through the broken window, the winter light had begun to lower, turning the yard silver and the walnut trunks black. She needed to decide where to sleep before the building became unfamiliar in darkness. The forge floor was brick and colder than earth. The front room had drafts from the window. The kitchen, for all its faults, had the rear door, the stove, and a corner away from the softboard. She returned there, closing the door with effort until the latch caught. Then she found the loose plaster that had blocked it and pushed it aside with her boot. The room dimmed at once. She set the county envelope on a shelf where no drip seemed to fall, placed the keys beside it, and unrolled the leather tools on the counter. 3 files. Scraper, spoon stake, dividers, burnisher, all. She touched each one lightly, as Alton had taught her to do when putting tools to bed. Then she rolled them back up and placed them inside her coat for the night. There was no food except the half of a roll from the barn, hardened at the edge. She ate it slowly and drank snowmelt from a jar after wiping the mouth with her sleeve. It tasted of dust and glass and cold. Her stomach accepted it without gratitude or complaint. For bedding, she used the moving blanket that still clung to her from Cambridge and a torn canvas drop cloth found beneath the sink. She shook the cloth outside until dust rose and disappeared into the darkening yard. Then she laid it in the corner between the stove and the interior wall, where the floor seemed firm. Her boots stayed on. The tool roll went beneath her head. The deed remained under her coat, against her ribs, because paper can feel like shelter when nothing else has learned to be. Night entered the cottage not as a curtain but as a filling of corners. First the shelves disappeared. Then the sink. Then the doorway to the front room became a black rectangle. The building began to speak in small ways after dark. A nail ticked in cooling wood. Water shifted somewhere in a wall. Wind pressed the cloth strips at the broken window and made them tap faintly against the frame. From the chimney came the occasional scratch and slide of loose soot dropping into the hearth. She lay still and counted sounds until she could tell which belonged to weather and which belonged to the building settling. The floor was hard. Her hip hurt. Cold found the line between her collar and neck, then the space behind her knees. She pulled the moving blanket tighter and watched the last gray light fade from the ceiling. Somewhere outside, the dog she had heard earlier barked once, twice, then gave up. For the first time in weeks, no one could ask her to move. That fact did not warm the room. It did not mend the roof or clear the chimney or put bread in the cupboard. It did not make the deed kind. But it lay beside her with a plainness she could touch. The county had given warnings. The clerk had given directions. The road had brought her through fields and walnut trees to a building with broken glass, wet brick, and workbenches under torn cloth. Nothing had opened its arms. Nothing had promised to save her. Still, beneath the soot and silence, the place held its breath around her. The forge was not empty, it had only been waiting. At dawn, the rear door had frozen lightly in its frame. Nora woke before any light reached the kitchen, stiff from the floor and aware first of the smell of her own wool coat, then of the larger smell of the cottage around her, damp plaster, soot, mouse dust, and the faint iron breath of tools left too many seasons without hands. Her right shoulder had gone numb beneath the tool roll. When she moved, the deed crackled under her coat like dry leaves. She did not rise quickly. Quickness belonged to people with warm rooms and full cupboards. She lay still while the building settled from night into morning, learning the difference between a board contracting in cold and a footstep that was not there. The forge did not hide its weaknesses. It announced them one by one, in a language of ticks, sighs, and loosened nails. By 7, gray light had entered the broken places. She folded the moving blanket, shook the dust from her sleeves, and began with the necessities, because necessity has a plain order and does not ask how a person feels. The hand pump in the yard did not work. Its handle moved 2 inches and stopped with a sound like bone. She chipped ice from its base with the heel of her boot, primed it with snowmelt from a jar, then tried again. Nothing came up except one brown thread of water that vanished before it reached the spout. Behind the forge, half hidden by sumac, she found the well cover. It was 2 boards nailed across a square curb of fieldstone, weighted with a broken chimney brick. She lay flat on her stomach and lifted one board enough to see darkness below. When she dropped a pebble, The water answered after a count of 3. The sound was deep, cold, and usable. There was an outhouse farther past the collapsed privy she had noticed from the lane, set beneath 3 black walnut trees and leaning less than it had a right to. Its door hung from one hinge. Snow had blown across the threshold. Inside, a wasp nest the size of a fist clung empty in the corner, and a Sears catalog from 1976 lay swollen on a shelf, its pages fused by damp. Nora cleaned the seat with snow, found a board for the door, and marked the path with 3 branches so she could find it after dark. The first 3 days became a map made of caution. She learned which kitchen board dipped near the rear door, which nail in the front room caught the edge of her boot, which brick in the forge rocked if stepped on from the left, but held if stepped on from the right. She learned that the roof dripped above the customer counter at noon, when sun touched the ice, and again after midnight, when wind shifted from the north. She learned that the safest place to stand in the workroom was 2 paces east of the hearth, where the brick floor had settled but not cracked. She tied a strip of cloth to every danger. 1 for the soft floor, 1 for the loose rafter, 1 for the broken glass under the window, 1 for the place beside the chimney where mortar had powdered into a gray heap. The strips moved faintly whenever air passed through the building, like small warnings breathing. Food came in careful pieces. A woman at the cafe sold day-old rolls in a paper bag for 25 cents and did not ask why Nora counted so slowly. Melted snow became drinking water after she strained it through a clean square torn from one of her father's shirts. At night, she wrapped the jar in the moving blanket so it would not freeze solid beside her. On the second afternoon, she took the county map and walked back to town. Vanderhoof Hardware occupied a narrow brick storefront with a green awning, 2 front windows, and a bell over the door that sounded tired but faithful. The air inside struck her almost gently: lamp oil, seed packets, sawdust, rubber boots, machine grease, and the peppery smell of iron nails sold by the pound. Wooden drawers climbed the walls behind the counter, each with a small brass label. Cotter pins, escutcheons, stove bolts, glazing points, copper rivets. On the floor near the door stood barrels of kindling and rock salt. From the ceiling hung coils of rope, snow shovels, lanterns, and a row of enamel pots that turned slowly in the draft. The man behind the counter was assembling a kerosene lantern when she entered. He was tall but folded at the shoulders, with a bald crown, white hair at the sides, and eyebrows so heavy they nearly met the rims of his glasses. His hands were square, scarred, and darkened around the nails, the hands of someone who knew the price of splinters. A tape measure clipped to his belt had polished the denim pail beneath it. He looked at her boots first, then at the leather roll. "You are the forge girl," he said. The words contained no surprise. In a town, news travels by paper, road, and appetite. I need to make it safe enough to sleep in. That is not a short list. No, sir. He set the lantern chimney into place and turned it once to seat it. Hiram Bell. I know. She waited for him to add something about danger or foolishness. He did not. He came around the counter with a yellow pad and a pencil tucked behind one ear. You have a roof leak. Bad chimney. Missing glass. Animal entry. Rotten threshold. And no heat. Yes, sir. Water. Found the well. Not drawn yet. Do not drink until it has been boiled. Yes, sir. Can you climb? If I have to. That is not an answer. It is a habit. She lowered her eyes to the floorboards. He saw it, made a mark on the pad, and did not press. Money. She held the silence because there was no graceful way to empty it. Mr. Bell tapped the pencil once against the pad. Mrs. Hatch called before you came. Nora's face did not move. She said you paid cash for a county headache and signed every warning without bargaining. She also said your people knew pewter. My father did. And before him. Yes. The hardware owner looked toward the front window, where the afternoon had gone flat and pale. My mother had a porringer from that forge. Plain rim. No ornament. Sat on her dresser with buttons in it. When she died, my sister took the dresser and left me the porringer, which tells you which one of us understood value. He wrote 3 more lines. I will open you a house account. I cannot promise when I can pay. I did not ask for poetry. I am telling you the truth. That is why I am doing it. He tore the page from the pad and slid it across the counter. The list was written in a hand so square it looked built rather than written. Nora read the first few items. Lantern. Mantles. Wick. Stove cement. Work gloves. Nails. Mr. Bell reached beneath the counter and brought out a thick, stained manual with a cracked spine. The cover read Practical Home Repairs for Owner-Occupants, 1968 edition. Someone had written Bell in marker across the top edge. You can read. Yes, sir. Then read before doing. Twice if sharp things are involved. 3 times if gravity is involved, and until you are bored if fire is involved. He placed the manual beside the list. I cannot buy that. You are not. I cannot borrow what I may ruin. You can return it dirty. Clean books are generally useless. She put one hand on the cover, feeling the rough cloth in a corner softened by many thumbs. Thank you. He waved the words away and began gathering supplies with the exact pace of a man filling a prescription. The first purchase, if it could be called that, went into a brown paper ledger under the heading Forge Account. Hiram Bell wrote the date, her name, and each item carefully. 1 Dietz lantern, used, $2.75. 1 pint kerosene, 19 cents. 1 bundle cotton lamp wicks, 9 cents. 1 pair canvas work gloves, 42 cents. 1 pound 8-penny common nails, 11 cents. 1 pound 10-penny sinkers, 13 cents. 1 small tin roofing cement, 29 cents. 1 stove brush, 35 cents. 1 flat cold chisel, 68 cents. 1 hand broom, 21 cents. 1 coil cotton sash cord, 50 feet, 57 cents. 1 packet glazing points, 12 cents. 1 bar yellow soap, 7 cents. 1 used galvanized pail, 30 cents. 1 sack stove coal, $1.10. He added a wire-handled chimney brush, 6 inches round, not new. $3, he said. That is below its pride. Nora looked at the brush. The bristles were bent in one quadrant and blackened near the center. It still works. Most things do, if insulted correctly. He wrapped the smaller items in newspaper and packed them into a wooden crate with 2 handles. Then he took a folded canvas tarp from a shelf behind him and laid it over the top. Loaned, he said before she could speak. Not given. There is a difference that lets both parties sleep. She carried the crate back in 2 stages, stopping first near the cemetery wall, then under the walnut trees at the lane. Her arms shook before she reached the door. In the kitchen, she set the supplies on the counter and opened the manual to the chimney section while the last light left the room. The manual had drawings of cheerful rooflines and chimneys that stood straight against white backgrounds. Her chimney was not cheerful. It was wounded, water-scored, and blocked somewhere above the smoke shelf. Still, the principles held. Do not light fire before verifying draft. Inspect flue from below with mirror and light. Remove loose nests and creosote. Brush from top when safe. If top access unsafe, clean upward in short sections with rods. Wear eye protection. Cover hearth opening. Test draft with smoke only. She read the chapter once. Then again. Then a third time, because fire was involved. The next morning, she began. She had no ladder fit for the roof, and the roof was not fit for a ladder, so she cleaned from below. First, she spread the borrowed tarp across the hearth and weighted its corners with bricks. Then she cut a slit large enough for the brush handle and tied cloth around her wrists to keep soot from traveling up her sleeves. From the front room, she took a cracked shaving mirror left behind in a drawer and angled it beneath the flue. With a lantern behind her shoulder, she could see almost nothing at first except blackness. Then the blackness moved. A clump of nest came down, dry twigs and feathers and soot woven into a hard mass. It struck the tarp with a soft collapse. She stood still until the dust settled. Then she reached upward with the brush on its first rod, turning clockwise as the manual instructed, not jabbing, not forcing, letting the bristles work the wall in circles. Creosote fell in flakes like burned bark. Some pieces were glossy and hard, some powdery as ground charcoal. The smell filled the room, bitter, tarred, and old enough to sting memory from the eyes. Every 6 inches, she withdrew the brush, cleared the bristles, added a rod, and began again. The first hour blackened her face to the cheekbones. The second made her shoulders tremble. By the third, her neck ached from looking upward, and soot had found its way beneath the cloth at her wrists. She stopped only to drink melted snow, wipe her eyes, and study the mirror. Twice the brush caught. Each time she resisted the urge to wrench it free. She turned it backward slowly, lowered it a fraction, then began again with less force. At noon, a packed obstruction broke loose. It came down as a heavy clot of soot, straw, and brick crumbs, striking the tarp so hard that ash lifted in a cloud and filled the hood. Nora stumbled back, coughing into her sleeve. For several minutes, she could see nothing but gray air turning in the lantern light. When it cleared, the smell had changed. Cold air had begun moving downward through the flue, carrying a faint outdoor dampness. She stood beneath it and held one soot-blackened hand inside the hood. Air touched her palm. Not much. Enough. She worked until dusk, 8 hours by the cracked watch at her wrist and the slow loss of light. The pail filled twice with creosote and nest debris. She carried the waste outside and dumped it in a low place beyond the sumac, where it lay black on snow like spilled ink. Then she swept the hearth, washed her face in water that turned gray at once, and sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the stove, too tired to eat. The next day, she inspected the stove. The cast iron was rusted but whole. One lid was missing, yet the firebox had not cracked. The pipe elbow lay behind it under a fallen shelf, dented but usable. She cleaned the ash chamber with the small broom, scraped scale from the draft door, and packed the seams with stove cement from Mr. Bell's tin, pressing it in with the flat of Alton's scraper. She let the cement set as long as the label demanded, though the waiting felt like hunger wearing another coat. Late on the 5th evening, she made the first fire. Not a real one at first. A test. She opened the rear door an inch, twisted newspaper into a loose spill, lit it with the lantern, and held it near the stovepipe before touching it to the kindling. The smoke hesitated, rolled toward the room, then lifted. She watched without breathing deeply. The manual had said smoke tells the truth. This smoke rose into the pipe, thin and gray, then vanished. She added 2 sticks of kindling, then 3, then a small piece of coal. The stove clicked as heat entered it. A smell of iron and curing cement filled the kitchen. Smoke seeped once from a seam near the elbow, then stopped as the draft strengthened. Nora crouched in front of the door, palms extended, and heat reached her skin so gradually that it seemed not arrival but permission. For supper, she placed a dented enamel pot on the stovetop with snowmelt, a handful of barley bought on account, half an onion from the cafe woman's paper bag, and a heel of bread torn into pieces. The broth was thin. The onion sweetened it. Steam rose into her face and gathered in her eyelashes. She ate from the pot with a pewter spoon found on the front room shelf, after scrubbing it with ash and soap until the bowl emerged from its tarnish. It had no maker's mark she could see. The handle was bent. It did its work. That night, the kitchen remained above freezing until after midnight. The morning after the first fire, she began the inventory of the workroom. She did it as Alton had taught her. Not by excitement, by order. She cleared a space on the bench, laid down newspaper from the drawer, and made columns in pencil on the back of the county envelope flap because no proper ledger had appeared yet. Position. Object. Condition. Use. Danger. At the hearth brick firebox, cracked at rear left, usable after repair. Iron grate, warped but present. Ash shovel, handle split. Bellows, leather torn through, wood frame intact. Coal rake, rusted. 2 fire bricks loose. North wall, rack of tongs, 9 pairs. Crucible tongs, long jaw, surface rust. Ladle tongs, spring weak. Flat grip tongs, 1 rivet replaced with nail. 3 pairs unknown, perhaps for holding molds. She marked them not yet. Under the bench, 5 clay crucibles, 2 cracked beyond use. 1 hairline, 2 sound by ring test. 1 iron pot with scale. 1 wooden crate containing pewter scraps sorted by type. Labels nearly gone. Handles. Plate rims. Bent spoons. Buttons. Pipe off cuts. A packet of tin foil hardened to powder. 1 sack of charcoal damp at the bottom. On the rear bench beneath the first cloth, wooden patterns, 12 pieces. Spoon stem. Cup foot. Hinge plate. Plain medallion. Border strip. Small handle. 3 unidentified curved pieces. 1 rosette. 1 lid knob. 1 blank block marked with compass circles. Beneath the second cloth, polishing station. Foot treadle wheel. Leather belt broken. Stone intact. Rotten stone jar. Cork fused. Pumice block. Chalk. 2 folded strips of chamois turned stiff. Tin of oil. Rancid. Bone-handled burnisher with split ferrule. 2 agate burnishers wrapped in wool. 1 chipped. East shelf bottles. Lamp black. Beeswax. Tallow. Shellac flakes. Vinegar jug empty. Small jar labeled sal ammoniac. Sealed. Paper packet labeled whiting. 3 cakes of polishing compound hardened but not useless. South wall, hanging tools. Crosspeen hammer, 12 ounce. Raising hammer, face dented. Rawhide mallet, cracked. 3 files too rusted for fine work, but possible for rough. Scribing awl. Compass. Bent dividers. 2 clamps. 1 hand vise. 1 hacksaw frame without blade. 1 saw set she could not place in pewter work and marked household. Then the molds. They had been stacked at the far end of the rear bench, half covered by the stiffest cloth. The smaller ones came first. Soapstone button molds, 6 cavities each, edges chipped. Brass spoon bowl mold, pitted but sound. 2-piece iron mold for cup handles, pins seized. Slate mold for plain discs. Maple mold charred at the mouth, perhaps used for wax models rather than pour. A long steel mold for narrow trim, heavy enough to require both hands. At the back, against the wall, lay the largest mold. It was not large in the way furniture is large, but in the way a tool becomes large when one person must move it alone. A rectangular steel billet, nearly 20 inches long, 14 wide, and 6 deep, with lifting ears at both ends and a casting cavity cut into the top face. It had been made for a platter or a commemorative plate. Perhaps, though the upper surface had been welded closed by a later plate of steel. The weld bead ran all the way around, dark and uneven, not factory work. Across the top, someone had fixed a cedar disc with 4 brass screws, as though it were a label, but there was no writing on it. Large sealed steel mold. Unknown. Too heavy. Then she paused. The line felt insufficient. She cleared dust from the cedar disc with her thumb. The wood released a faint scent, dry and clean beneath decades of soot. Cedar did not belong on a working mold. Cedar burned too easily near heat. Cedar was for drawers. Chests, keepsakes, moss. It had been placed there for a reason other than use. She took the spoon stake from her tool roll and tapped the nearest small mold. It answered with a clear iron note, short and solid. She tapped the long trim mold. Higher, thinner. She tapped the large sealed mold near one corner. The sound was wrong. Not hollow exactly. Not solid. A chambered note, dull at the edges, as if metal enclosed air and air enclosed something else. She tapped again at the opposite corner. Different. She lifted one end with both hands and immediately set it down. The weight was uneven. A solid steel block of that size would have been heavy beyond argument, but this was not heavy in the correct way. One side dragged. The other rose almost reluctantly, as if contents inside had shifted years ago and settled permanently. Nora stood in the forge with soot still in the lines of her knuckles and listened to her own breathing. The cedar disc had 4 screws. Brass, not steel. Soft enough to remove if corrosion had not married them to the wood. She went to the hardware crate, took the screwdriver mister. Bell had added, without writing it in the ledger, and fitted the blade into the first slot. The screw turned half a breath, then stopped. She pressed down with both palms. The slot nearly stripped. She stopped, rubbed a little lamp oil into the screw head, and waited. Alton had taught waiting as a tool. Oil needed time to enter threads the eye could not see. After 10 minutes, she tried again, slower. The screw gave with a faint cry and rose 1 thread. By the time all 4 screws lay on the bench, evening had gathered outside the broken window. The cedar disc lifted cleanly. Beneath it was not steel, but a round plug of pewter poured into a countersunk hole and scraped flat. In the center of the plug, Nearly hidden by tarnish was a small impressed mark, a fiddlehead inside a circle. Nora knew the shape. Not from this place. From Alton's stories. From a porringer ear wrapped in flour sack and carried in a cabinet before a dealer took it. From a family pattern spoken of as if it were sleeping under glass somewhere no one could reach. She did not touch the mark at first. She only bent close and let the lantern light find it. The plug had a seam. With the awl, she traced the circle gently and found the edge. It had been sealed with wax or resin long ago, hardened into a black line. She warmed the area with a candle stub until the resin softened, then worked the awl around it 1/16 of an inch at a time. When the plug loosened, she used the dividers as hooks and lifted it free. Inside was a recessed nut, square-headed and black with age. The wrench was not in her tools. She searched the south wall, then the drawer beneath the bench, then a coffee can full of rusted bolts. At last she found a square socket brace, handmade, its handle wrapped with leather. It fit. The first turn took nearly all her strength. The second came easier. At the fourth, something inside the sealed mold released with a low, careful click. Nora stepped back. Nothing happened. No secret door opened. No hidden drawer slid out. The mold remained a scarred block on a sagging bench in a condemned forge with dusk pressing against the windows. She let her hands rest at her sides until their shaking diminished. Then she examined the welded plate again and saw what dust had hidden not one plate, but two. The top sheet had been fitted over an inner lid whose edge lay beneath the weld bead. The square bolt had drawn an internal bar away. At the right lifting ear, a hairline gap had opened. She slipped the cold chisel into the gap and pressed. The lid lifted a fraction. Not enough. She worked around the edge, not prying hard, not tearing what she did not yet understand. The seal had been painted with black pitch after welding, and the pitch still held in places. She warmed it with the candle, scraped, pressed, waited. A 1/4 inch, then half. The smell that came out was cedar, wax, paper, and metal kept from air. At last, using both hands and a strip of canvas to protect her fingers, she raised the inner lid. Inside the mold, wrapped in oilcloth and nested in cedar shavings, were packages laid with the exactness of a person who expected time to be rough but not careless. The top package was long and narrow. She unwrapped it first. A set of heirloom tools lay inside, each oiled and labeled in a hand browned by age. 6 chasing tools with shaped tips. A tiny planishing hammer. 2 agate burnishers finer than any she had held. A spoon bowl stake, polished bright beneath its oil. A pair of dividers with a brass hinge. A scribe. A narrow ladle with a pouring lip as thin as a leaf. She set them on the bench one by one. The second package held raw material, bars of tin stamped with a maker's mark, smaller ingots of antimony, a strip of copper, and several pewter blanks wrapped separately. Each was labeled with ratio notes. 92 tin, 7 antimony, 1 copper, for spoons. 91, 8, 1, harder edge. Do not overheat. Skim twice. The third package was flat and wrapped in flour sack. Inside was a bundle of paper patterns and molds smaller than the ones lost from Alton's barn, yet kin to them in line and spirit. A fiddlehead porringer ear. A spoon stem with a narrow ridge. A cupfoot with 3 incised rings. A small medallion marked with the same craft sign beneath the cedar disc. The patterns had been rubbed with wax to survive damp. They smelled faintly of bees and smoke. The fourth package was a tin box. Nora did not open it immediately. She sat on the bench because her knees had become unreliable. Outside, a crow moved in the walnut branches and shook loose a little snow. The room had darkened around the lantern, so that the uncovered tools seemed to float in their own circle of amber light. She placed her palm flat on the tin box. It was cold. The lid was tied with cotton cord and sealed with dark wax. The wax bore the fiddlehead mark. She broke it with Alton's awl. Inside were envelopes, coin rolls, folded bank wrappers, and a military medal wrapped in blue cloth. She began with the envelopes. The first contained bills, 20s and 50s, some older than others, banded in paper that cracked when she touched it. The second held smaller notes, 10s, 5s, 1s, each stack labeled in pencil. The third contained bank certificates and a withdrawal slip from a Concord bank dated in the spring of 1951. The coin rolls were hand-wrapped, not machine-rolled, their paper browned and tied with thread. She counted because counting was a way to remain in the room. Bills first. 10 stacks of $100 notes. 5 stacks of 50s. Bundles of 20s. 10s. 5s. And 1s. She laid them in rows on the bench, not trusting the first count, then counted again, moving each stack from left to right. The lantern hissed softly. Her finger pads grew dry from paper. 38,000 in larger bills. Then the smaller bundles. 41,000. 900. Then 41,000. 990. Then $41,999. The last $1 bill was folded around a flattened penny. She opened the coin rolls with the awl, carefully, preserving the paper where she could. Silver $50. Walking Liberty halves, several worn nearly smooth. Franklin halves with the bell still clear. Mercury dimes, their winged caps softened by handling. Roosevelt silver dimes from the years before the change. Washington quarters, all silver. 2 barber quarters so worn the dates were ghosts. A small envelope of Indian head cents and wheat pennies. 1 1909 VDB, sent in a square of folded paper marked "Do Not Spend." Not rare enough to change a life, perhaps, but kept for some reason of the hand. She counted the coins by denomination, then by wrapper, then once more by written labels. 37 cents lay loose in the bottom of the tin box, 3 dimes, 1 nickel, and 2 pennies, 1 wheat, 1 newer. The total, written twice on the back of an envelope and once on a scrap of newspaper, came to $42,000.37. The number did not enter her all at once. It sat on the bench among the tools, exact and impossible, while the forge held its cold breath around it. She had no picture for that amount. It was not a mansion, not a motor car in a catalog, not a shining future. It was shingles, mortar, glass, coal, food enough to read manuals without shaking, time enough to learn what could be saved. She wrapped the coins again with hands that moved slowly from fear of dropping even one. Then she opened the blue cloth. The metal inside was not polished. Its ribbon had faded, and the bronze bore the darkening of years shut away from air. The front showed a figure with a shield and sword. The back held words worn but legible. The paper folded around it named a man in a regiment, and beneath that, in careful script, was written Musargon, 1918. Nora knew only enough history to understand that a war had once taken men across an ocean and returned some in boxes. Some changed past speech, some not at all. She placed the medal apart from the money. There was one more envelope in the tin box. It was thicker than the others, sealed but not with wax. Across the front, in handwriting she did not know, were 5 words. For the one who opens. She did not open it that night. The refusal was not distrust. It was capacity. A person can receive only so much before receiving becomes another form of breaking. She had opened metal and found tools. She had opened cloth and found patterns. She had opened the tin and found money enough to make the room tilt around her. The letter could wait until morning, when light could stand beside it. She packed the bills back into their envelopes, the coins into their rolls, the metal into its cloth. The tools she oiled again with the smallest touch and laid in the inner chamber as they had been, except the tin box she carried to the kitchen. Then she lowered the mold lid, replaced the pewter plug, set the cedar disc over it without tightening the screws, and covered the mold with its torn cloth. No one else needed to know before dawn. She took the lantern and went outside. Night had come clear and hard. The lane shone faintly where ice had skinned the mud. The walnut trees stood black against a sky bright with winter stars. Beyond the yard, through sumac and dead grass, she followed the dip of the land until she found water moving under a crust of ice. It was a narrow runnel, perhaps drainage from the fields, perhaps the remnant of a stream that had once served the forge. It made a patient sound beneath the frozen edges. Nora crouched on the bank and set the lantern beside her. The water did not hurry. It slipped under ice, vanished beneath leaves, appeared again where moonlight found it. She watched it carry bits of bark and one pale thread of grass. Her hands, blackened at the nails and lined with dust from hidden money, rested on her knees. The building behind her was a darker shape among darker trees, broken and waiting, with a chimney that had not yet learned smoke again. After a while, she took the sealed envelope from inside her coat and held it without opening it. The paper had warmed against her body. Whoever had written it had expected a stranger, perhaps a descendant, perhaps no one at all. They had placed words inside a mold and trusted silence to keep them. Nora listened to the water until her breathing matched its small, deliberate continuance. Then she went back inside, set the envelope on the shelf beside the deed, and slept on the kitchen floor with the tin box beneath her hand. The forge was not empty. It had only been waiting. Morning came through the torn cloth at the window in narrow bands. The first band reached the shelf before it reached the floor. It touched the county envelope, the ring of keys, the sealed letter, and a line of soot that had settled there during the night. For a while she watched without rising, seeing how light entered a room that had not expected anyone to be there. It found the ordinary things first. Dust, paper, cold glass, the curve of a jar. Her hand still rested on the tin box beneath the blanket. When she sat up, the whole body objected quietly. Shoulder, hip, neck, knees. She moved as she had learned to move in the building, first listening, then shifting, then placing weight. The stove had gone dark before dawn. A faint skin of ice had formed in the jar beside it. She broke it with the handle of a spoon and washed her face in the cold, holding her breath through the first touch. The letter waited. She did not open it until she had swept the kitchen floor, fed a handful of coal to a small new fire, boiled water, and set the tin box on the counter where the light could fall across it. There was a kind of manners in that order. The room had given her shelter. The metal had given up its secret. Words deserved a surface cleared of ash. She laid the envelope flat and studied the writing. At first it belonged to no one. Brown ink, slanted hand, patient pressure at the downstrokes. Then some resemblance moved through it. Not exact, not proof, but kinship. The capital letters held the same upright restraint as the labels on the packets inside the mold. The lower loops leaned the way Alton's letters had leaned when his hand tired near the end of a note. Not the same hand. The same school of hands. The same belief that a word should stand firmly enough to be found later. The envelope had not been sealed with wax. It had been tucked closed, trusting the chamber more than glue. She lifted the flap. Inside were 6 pages folded twice. The paper had yellowed at the edges but had survived in the darkness with a firmness that felt almost deliberate. A faint scent rose from it, cedar and metal and the dry sweetness of stored cloth. She unfolded the pages along their original creases and began. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened this, then either blood, mercy, accident, or hunger has brought you to the bench where I left my hands as best I could. I do not know your name. I do not know whether you came from my line, from a neighbor's line, from the town, from ruin, or from no one who would claim you. I only know that you found the mold and took the time to open it without breaking it. That tells me enough to write plainly. My name is Ruth Abiah Vale Whitcomb, born in Concord in 1884, daughter of Silas Vale, son of Ezra Vale, son of Nathaniel Vale, who came from Gloucestershire by way of Boston and set his first shop near this road in 1788, when the fields were still wider than the town. My mother was Mercy Larkin of Acton, and her mother, Judith Pike, kept accounts for the shop after the men came home tired and careless with numbers. Do not let anyone tell you this was only men's work. The men poured in daylight. The women measured in the evening, polished in lamplight, kept the ledgers, soothed customers, and knew which families needed credit and which needed dignity more than credit. I write because Dr. Samuel Brackett of Boston, at Massachusetts General Hospital, has told me the growth in my chest is not an inflammation and will not be cured by rest. He was kind enough not to decorate the truth. I came back to the forge on the train with snow on my boots and began putting away what I could. Our trade did not end because pewter became useless in a single day. It ended in pieces. Aluminum came cheap. Silver plate became a bride's wish. Factory goods crossed the counter at prices no hand shop could answer. Then came the fire in the rear shed on October 17, 1919, when the annealing coals caught the oil rags and took the pattern rack, the account books, and my brother Elias's left hand. After that, the town began to say we were finished. By March 3, 1920, we closed the front door to customers and opened it only for repairs. Repairs became fewer. Silence became regular. I had a husband, Thomas Whitcomb, who carried stretcher bandages in France and came home from the Great War with coughing lungs and a calm face that fooled strangers. He died in 1926, not by bullet but by what the war left inside him. My brother Elias, who should have inherited the heavier molds, died of pneumonia before his 50th winter. My son Daniel took work in Springfield and never loved the smell of tin. I did not blame him. No trade is an inheritance if it is only a chain. Still, I could not let everything be sold by weight. Here are instructions, because sentiment without method is a poor gift. For tablespoons and small eating pieces, use 92 parts tin, 7 parts antimony, 1 part copper. Keep the melt between 465 and 500 degrees Fahrenheit. Do not chase a hotter shine. If the surface yellows, you have gone too far. Skim once after the last ingot softens. Wait until the metal gathers its bright skin, then skim again. Warm the mold until beeswax smokes but does not flare. For a 2-piece mold, smoke both faces with a candle. Clamp evenly from hinge to mouth, and pour in one steady motion. Count to 12 before unclamping small pieces, longer for thick feet and handles. Let the casting finish becoming itself before you ask anything of it. For porringer ears, use the fiddlehead pattern only with the harder mix, 91 tin, 8 antimony, 1 copper. The curl will tear if filed from the outside first. Work the inside with the fine half round, then the throat, then the outer lip. Rotten stone with oil for the first polish. Whiting dry on linen for the last. Leave honest marks. A handmade thing should not pretend to have been born from a machine. The money is not treasure. It is time. Roof time. Coal time. Bread time. Time to refuse a bad bargain. Time to learn emotion properly before needing it for wages. Spend it like a careful person spends winter light. If you are my kin, forgive me for not finding you. If you are not, then perhaps kinship has been too narrowly described. I have seen blood abandon and strangers carry. I have watched a neighbor leave milk in a storm and a cousin sell a cradle for drink. What we keep is not always what we own. What we inherit is not always what is named in court. I have hidden the patterns because tools can cross years better than voices can. I have sealed the metal because Thomas should not be tossed in a dealer's tray. I have left one marker outside, so you may know this was not a trick. Behind the shop, past the well, the south walnut has an iron horseshoe grown into the bark at shoulder height. Thomas hung it there before he went overseas. The tree took it in and did not let go. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Ruth Abiah Vale Whitcomb, Concord, Massachusetts. November 12, 1951. She reached the end and stayed bent over the pages. The stove made a small settling sound. Coal shifted inward, giving a little red at its heart. Outside, meltwater began its slow work along the roof edge. Drop by drop, and one drop found the bucket in the front room with an exact metal note. She had not noticed she had stopped breathing until she drew air again and the paper moved faintly beneath it. She read the letter a second time. Not because she had missed the words, but because some sentences changed their weight after being carried once. The names arranged themselves like boards laid across a ditch. Nathaniel, Ezra, Silas, Mercy, Judith, Ruth, Thomas, Elias, Daniel. The line was not clean. It bent, broke, vanished, doubled back through hands that measured after supper and polished under lamplight. A trade had slept inside women's ledgers as much as in men's molds. No courthouse had recorded that kind of inheritance. No dealer would have paid extra for it. She placed one finger on the line about money being time. Then she withdrew her hand, as if touching too long might blur the ink. The pages had been folded along the same creases for decades, and she honored them. First the bottom up, then the top down, then side to side. She pressed the folds with the edge of her palm and returned the letter to its envelope, but she did not seal it. Some things should be able to breathe after being shut away. The kitchen looked different without changing. The shelf remained bowed. The stove still missed one lid. The window cloth hung ragged in its frame. Yet the room had acquired depth, as if a hidden door had opened behind every poor surface and shown the years standing there patiently, shoulder to shoulder. She put on her coat, took the lantern though morning had arrived, and went out the rear door. The yard was bright with the hard glitter of frozen thaw. Her boots broke a thin crust over mud. Past the pump and the well cover, sumac stems stood red and bare. The collapsed privy leaned in its own long surrender, and beyond it the land dipped toward the little run of water where she had watched the night pass. She turned south. The walnut tree was not difficult to find once she knew to look. It was larger than the others, trunk divided at 12 feet into 3 heavy limbs, bark dark and deeply ridged. At shoulder height, half swallowed by growth, an iron horseshoe curved from the trunk. The tree had folded itself over the metal year by year until only the outer arc and 2 nail holes remained visible. Rust had stained the bark below it in narrow lines, like old rain. She stood before it with one hand lifted but not touching. A man had hung that iron before going to war. A woman had remembered it when her own body began failing. The tree had done what living things sometimes do better than people. It had kept. At the base of the trunk, snow had melted away in a crescent. Black walnut husks lay collapsed there, their shells opened by squirrels. She crouched and moved a few aside, not searching for anything else, only clearing the ground around the roots. One root curved above the soil like a wrist. Moss grew along it, green even in the cold. She touched the horseshoe then. It was rough beneath her fingers, colder than bark, colder than morning, yet held so firmly by the tree that it no longer seemed separate from it. She left her hand there until the chill entered her skin. When she returned to the forge, she took from the tin box the metal wrapped in blue cloth and set it on the shelf beside the letter. Not displayed. Not hidden. Present. There was one heirloom she could use that day without spending, selling, or disturbing anything sacred. Among the packets inside the mold had been a slender beeswax candle, wrapped in brown paper and labeled for smoking molds. It had darkened with age, the wick stiff and slightly bent, but beeswax keeps its body when kept from heat and mice. She carried it to the front room and placed it in a chipped iron candlestick from the workbench drawer. 60 years, perhaps more, had passed since the candle was rolled by a hand now gone. She lit it from the stove flame. The wick hesitated, gave one blue thread, then steadied into a small gold teardrop. The smell of beeswax entered the front room, warm and honeyed, cutting through dust and cold plaster. It was not enough light to repair anything. It did not reach the corners. But on the counter, where hands had once waited for mended cups and polished spoons, the candle gave a circle no wider than a dinner plate, and within that circle the wood grain appeared almost alive. She set the letter beside the candlestick and sat behind the counter on an overturned crate. A shop is not made by walls alone. She understood that in the slow manner of someone warming a frozen hand. A shop is made by trust placed down in increments. A repair accepted, a promise kept, a name written correctly. Credit extended when pride is all a customer can afford. The building had lost its customers, its sign, its roofline, its heat, and nearly its memory, but the shape of its purpose remained. She looked toward the broken window, through which the winter yard appeared in pieces. It was strange, the chain that had led her here, and not strange at all. A great uncle hiding nothing, simply teaching. A father placing a child near the workbench instead of sending her away. A custodian in Lexington opening a door before dawn and handing over coffee from a thermos. A clerk who did not mistake poverty for carelessness. A hardware man who entered her debt in a ledger without making her beg for the dignity of repayment. A cafe woman who put yesterday's rolls into a bag and charged less than bread was worth. None of them had saved her in the manner stories like to announce. They had each held one link without knowing the length of the chain. And you, listening tonight, may have one of those links in your own keeping. Maybe someone once paid your bus fare when your hands were too empty, or left soup at a door, or spoke your name correctly on a day when the world had been careless with it. Maybe the kindness was so small that you almost feel foolish remembering it. Do not feel foolish. Small kindnesses are often the exact size by which a person survives the hour in front of her. If you have one, write it down in the comments. Not to make a grand lesson of it, only to let it be witnessed, the way a candle witnesses a room. The candle burned with almost no sound. She did not decide the future that morning. Decisions made too quickly after mercy can become another kind of fear. She did not plan repairs beyond the ones needed for safety. She did not touch the money except to secure it again. She did not lift all the patterns and arrange them for admiration. She only made a place for each thing. The letter went back into its envelope and then into the tin box. The metal remained wrapped but separate. The tools returned to their oilcloth, except the fine agate burnisher, which she held for several minutes because its weight fit her palm so exactly that it felt remembered by the hand rather than learned. At last she wrapped it too. By afternoon, the fire had warmed the kitchen enough for the window ice to weep. She used one of the old jars as a lamp chimney for the candle and carried it from room to room. In the front room, she brushed dust from the counter. In the forge, she wiped the bench around the opened mold. She did not clean everything. That would come later, slowly and with soap, water, rags, and days. But she cleared a square no larger than a tray, because beginnings need some measure, and a tray-sized beginning was honest. Then she took the money, letter, metal, and the smallest packets of patterns and placed them inside the tin box again. The box went under the floorboard in the kitchen corner, where the board lifted cleanly if pressed from one end. She had discovered it on the second day and marked it in memory, not cloth. Over the box she laid a flat stone from outside, then the board, then the moving blanket. Not because she expected anyone, because keeping was part of receiving. Before dark, she went once more to the south walnut. The horseshoe had already begun to vanish into shadow. She stood there until the cold reached her ankles and the lane beyond the trees lost its edges. No word was spoken. The marker needed none. That night, she slept with the heirlooms beside her. The tool roll was under her head. The agate burnisher, wrapped again in wool, lay near her shoulder. The letter rested in its envelope within the tin box beneath the floor, close enough that she could have reached it in 3 movements if fear had woken her. On the shelf above the stove, the metal waited in blue cloth. The candle, shortened but not spent, cooled in its iron holder. The building made its night sounds around her. Now, when a nail ticked or a board sighed, she did not hear only damage. She heard age asking to be addressed carefully. She heard work waiting in proper order. Roof before plaster. Chimney before fire. Glass before polish. Food before pride. Sleep before haste. She turned on her side and faced the dark square of the doorway that led to the front room. The candle scent still lingered faintly, honey under soot. Beyond the front room was the forge, and beyond the forge, the bench, the hearth, the hidden chamber, the molds, and all those hands that had left instructions without knowing whose hands would find them. Cold gathered at the floor. She pulled the blanket closer and rested one palm flat against the boards. For the first time since the door had closed behind her weeks ago, the dark did not feel like being put outside. It felt like being kept until morning. Snow came on December 6th, 4 inches by noon and another 2 before dark, softening the lane until the walnut trees appeared to stand in a field of torn wool. Nora had been awake since before first light, not because the cold had sharpened, though it had, but because the first flakes made the roof speak. What had been a drip became a tapping, then a faint inward hiss where snow found broken shingles, melted against warmer places, and passed through. In the front room, 3 buckets caught water with 3 different notes. In the kitchen, a brown stain widened on the ceiling near the stovepipe. In the forge, meltwater ran down the rear wall and darkened the bricks beneath the workbench. She did not climb that day. Snow covered holes too kindly. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table with the borrowed repair manual open to the roofing chapter and read the whole thing 3 times, as instructed. The first reading gave her the names of things. Rafter, sheathing, felt, drip edge, starter course, exposure, ridge cap, flashing. The second gave her the order. Tear off what was loose, inspect what carried weight, replace rot before covering it, lay underlayment straight, keep courses square, nail where the next shingle will protect the head. The third reading gave her humility. Gravity was involved. She measured what she could from the ground, then from the loft stairs after testing each step with a broom handle. The forge roof was a low gable over the workroom, with the cottage roof joining it in a clumsy valley that had been patched too many times. The main run measured 28 feet along the eave, with a 12-foot rise from eave to ridge on each slope. The cottage shoulder added another 10 by 16 feet of trouble, and the valley collected leaves, ice, and every mistake previous owners had made. On the back of an old envelope, she calculated square footage, waste, and overlap. 3 squares of 3-tab asphalt shingles would cover the safer portions if she cut carefully. 1 roll of 15-pound felt would not be enough, 2 rolls would. Galvanized roofing nails, 1 1/4 inch, at 4 nails per shingle, more at the edges. Drip edge for the front eave could wait. Valley flashing could not. She wrote each number twice, because numbers written under stress like to betray the hand. At Vanderhoof Hardware, Mr. Bell read the list without comment. Then he went to the back room and returned with a hatchet wrapped in an oil-dark rag. Its head was narrow, its pole worn, its handle shaped by a long dead grip. "My uncle used this on slate roofs before his knees quit," he said.
"It is not for chopping kindling."
"It is for persuasion. I can borrow it." That is what I said, though I had not yet used the words. He added a chalk line, a roofing knife, 2 bundles of cedar shims, and a coffee can half full of salvaged cut nails for places where new fasteners would split aged wood. Then he wrote the price of the shingles and felt into the ledger, slowly, as though giving the numbers time to settle kindly. "You need a man who knows rafters. I cannot pay a man who knows rafters." I said need. I did not say hire. The man arrived the next morning after the snow crusted over. He came walking down the lane in a canvas coat patched at both elbows, carrying a pry bar over one shoulder and a lunch pail in the other hand. He had a face browned by years of sun even in winter, a white stubble that looked like frost, and eyes so pale they seemed almost without color. Mr. Bell had sent him, though he did not say so until much later. "Silas Mercer," he said. "Roofs, mostly." Before my wife said the ground required more of my attention. Nora offered coffee made thin on the stove. He accepted half a cup, drank it standing, then stepped outside to look up at the roof. After 10 minutes, he said, "It wants saving badly." "Yes, sir." That does not mean it can't be. He would not take pay. He would not take the coin she offered, the bills she had decided she could spare, or the promise of later money. He accepted only a place by the stove at noon and whatever food she was already eating, which for several days was barley, onion, and bread ends softened in broth. He spoke little, and when he did, his words came shaped like tools, meant to strike one place. They worked 11 days. The first 2 were for clearing. They shoveled snow from the safer slope using a board tied to rope, then tore away shingles that had curled like dead leaves. Moss came up in pads. Rusted nails resisted and then gave with a complaint. Under the tar paper, the sheathing showed its history: sound boards near the ridge, softened boards near the valley, a blackened patch around the chimney where flashing had failed for years. Silas knelt on the roof as if kneeling on a church floor, reading rot with the end of his knife. Here. He tapped a board. He tapped another. Not. The split rafter lay under the valley, one end darkened and fibrous, where water had traveled along it. They could not replace the entire member without opening more roof than weather allowed, so Silas taught her to sister it. They cut a length of straight 2x6 from stock mister. Bell had found behind his store, fitted it alongside the weakened rafter, and clamped the 2 together. Nora drilled pilot holes by hand, slow enough not to split aged wood. Then they drove carriage bolts through both, washers wide as quarters. Nuts tightened until the old rafter and new one bore together. Not pretty, Silas said. No, pretty is for dry roofs. On the 4th day, wind rose from the west and tried to take the felt from their hands. Silas showed her how to tack one end, kneel with her weight on the roll, and let only as much open as she could control. The felt had to lie flat, lap 2 inches on horizontal seams and 6 inches at the valley. Wrinkles were not harmless. Water found pride and punished it. The chalk line became a lesson in obedience. Snap the first course straight. Trust that line, not the eye. Every shingle above depends on what the first one was allowed to become. He marked a 5-inch exposure, then had her measure again, and again, until the line across the roof looked like a quiet command. When she drove the first roofing nail, the head stood high. Silas pointed. That nail's proud. She looked at it. Pull. She did. By the end of the day, she understood the rhythm he wanted. Place. Strike. Strike. Set. 3 strokes if the arm learned. 4 if the wood was stubborn. Never bury the head so deep it cut the shingle. Never leave it standing in weather. Nail above the cutout. Below the seal line. Straight through. Not angled. Bad nails made future leaks. Future leaks made future grief. Her fingers split at the knuckles. Tar marked her cuffs. Twice she slid and caught herself on a nailed cleat, heart beating hard against the roof boards. Silas did not comfort her after the first slide. He only moved the cleat lower and said, Boots remember fear. Make them remember balance, too. The valley took 3 days. They removed layers of past repairs, each one laid over the last by someone hoping cover could substitute for correction. Beneath tar, tin, and curled shingles, the flashing had rusted through in 2 places. Mr. Bell had sent a length of galvanized sheet folded down the center. Silas fitted it with care, leaving the lower end open so water could leave. Nora cut shingles to the valley line with a roofing knife, hands aching from the pressure, and bedded each trimmed edge where wind could not lift it. By December 17th, the roof no longer answered snow with panic. They finished near mid-afternoon, under a sky the color of unbleached wool. The ridge caps lay even. The valley shone dull and sound. Around the chimney, where masonry work still waited, they had made a temporary cricket of tar paper, roofing cement, and flashing tucked well enough to turn water aside for a season. Silas came down the ladder last, carrying the hatchet tucked through his belt. His knees made him pause on the final rung. When his boots reached the ground, he looked once at the roof and then toward the walnut lane. It will shed, he said. For him, It was almost praise. Nora slept that night without setting buckets in the front room. When snow began again after midnight, she lay awake for a little while, listening. The roof received it with a settled silence. January brought a cold that made the stove seem smaller. The chimney, now that the roof no longer poured water straight into it, showed its true condition with an honesty Nora might have appreciated on another object. Near the base, bricks had spalled so badly that their faces flaked under her thumb. Mortar had powdered into gray dust between courses. Above the smoke shelf, where creosote had hidden damage, gaps opened like missing teeth. The flue still drew, but not with a steadiness she trusted, and trust around fire had to be earned. The manual was useful until it became too general. Then Mr. Bell gave her a masonry pamphlet from 1949, folded around a receipt for furnace pipe, and Silas Mercer returned for one morning to look at the stack from outside. "Do not use Portland straight," he said. "Too hard. Old brick wants a softer neighbor." At the hardware store, Mr. Bell measured from bins and sacks as if he were composing medicine. Hydraulic lime. Washed sand. Fire clay. A little Portland only where heat and weather argued for it. Not enough to bully the brick. For the exterior joints above the roofline, he advised 1 part natural hydraulic lime to 2½ parts sand, with a whisper of Portland in the weather cap, because winter did not respect historical purity. For the firebox and smoke chamber, 1 part fire clay, 1 part lime, 2 parts sharp sand, mixed stiff and used before it tired. "Mortar is not paste," he said. "Do not smear hope into a joint and call it done." The work took 3 weeks in temperatures that sat mostly in the 20s. Each morning, she warmed the bricks near the stove before carrying them to the forge, because cold masonry stole water too quickly and left mortar weak. She raked powdered joints with a bent nail set into a wooden handle, cleaning them to sound depth, 1/2 inch where she could, more where decay demanded it. Dust fell into her hair and collected at the corners of her mouth. She brushed each joint with a dry paintbrush, then misted it lightly with warm water from a tin cup. Her hands went numb every 15 minutes. She learned to work until feeling left the fingertips, then go to the stove and hold them near heat without touching iron. Too much heat too quickly made pain bloom sharp under the nails. Patient warmth returned the hands piece by piece. Thumb. Palm. Knuckle. Wrist. Then she went back to the chimney and pressed mortar into joints with a pointing trowel mister. Bell had filed narrower for her. On the outside, she worked from a short ladder tied to a walnut trunk with rope, never climbing higher than Silas had allowed. Brick by brick, she removed those too far gone to hold weather. Some came free whole. Some dissolved in her grip. Replacement bricks came from the fallen pile near the sumac, chosen for size, soundness, and a color near enough not to shame the wall. She soaked them briefly before setting them, tapped them into line with the wooden end of the trowel, then struck the joints after the mortar had thumbprint firmness. Inside, the smoke chamber was worse. Soot hid cracks. Old repairs had been made with cement hard as pride and twice as damaging. She chipped them out slowly, wearing goggles that fogged from her breath. Bits of mortar struck her cheeks. Her shoulders burned. Each evening, she swept the forge floor and carried out a pail of gray waste, seeing almost no change unless she forced herself to compare one joint at a time. A bad day came with freezing rain. Water glazed the lane and sealed the walnut husks in clear ice. The stove smoked on lighting because pressure had shifted outside, and for 1 hour the kitchen filled with a faint blue haze that caught in her throat. She opened the rear door, watched heat flee the room, and stood beside it wrapped in the moving blanket while the smoke found its way upward at last. That day she completed only 5 joints. Before sleep, she wrote the number in the new ledger, Mr. Bell had given her. 5 sound joints are not nothing. By late January, the chimney had begun to look less like a wound and more like work interrupted for rest. The firebox joints were tight. The loose bricks around the smoke shelf had been reset. The exterior stack, though still truncated where the old break remained, stood capped and shed water. She mixed the final mortar before dawn and used it to dress the last gap where smoke had once slipped into the room. The test fire came on the 29th. She used dry kindling no thicker than her thumb, a twist of newspaper, and 1 small piece of coal. The rear door stood open. The lantern sat ready. She watched the flame catch, lower, then steady. Smoke rose, entered the pipe, drew through the clean chamber, and went where it was supposed to go. Outside, she stood in the yard and looked up. The chimney breathed a clean gray thread into the cold morning. No smoke leaked through the wall. No cough of soot fell back into the hearth. No bitter haze entered the kitchen. The thread rose, thinned, and disappeared among the bare walnut branches. She remained there until her hands ached in the cold, because a chimney drawing correctly is not a small thing. It is the difference between shelter and danger, between fire as companion and fire as it is one of the old agreements people make with winter. Inside, the stove gave heat without argument. Late January turned the floors from surface into labor. Once the roof held and the chimney drew, Nora could no longer ignore what lay beneath her feet. Dirt could be swept. Rot could not. The kitchen boards were white pine, hand-planed, some nearly 16 inches wide, fastened with rosehead nails that caught light like tiny dark flowers. In the front room, years of boots had worn a shallow path from door to counter. Near the broken window, water had lifted grain and left a gray, raised patch. In the forge, brick remained brick, but the cottage floors asked for another kind of attention. She began by lifting what was loose and refusing to lift what still belonged. A modern person, the manual warned, will often destroy good wood trying to make it look new. She did not want new. New had no patience in it. She wanted clean, sound, sealed, and honest. The random orbit sander rented from Vanderhoof cost $14 a day, written in the ledger with a line beneath it because Mr. Bell considered rented machines morally impatient. He gave her 3 discs each of 80, 120, and 220 grit, then added a dust mask and a warning. Do not stay in one place. I know. The machine does not know you know. The first pass with 80 grit changed the sound of the house. The sander hummed low and steady, pulling dust from the floor in pale clouds that smelled of pine, mouse, and the damp years buried under both. Nora worked with the grain, keeping the machine moving, letting it cut grime rather than history. Under the gray surface, the boards emerged darker than she expected. Honey were protected by old rugs, almost brown where smoke and age had entered the wood. She stopped often to vacuum with a borrowed shop vac whose cord ran from a neighbor's outdoor outlet by way of an extension mister. Bell had arranged without explanation. The rosehead nails required care. She set each one below the surface with a nail punch and small hammer, tapping lightly, never driving so deep that the old head vanished. Where boards had split, she worked glue into cracks with a sliver of cedar, clamped them overnight, and filled only what would catch a sock or gather dirt. Gaps between boards remained, dark lines of age that winter air could pass through but not shame. The second pass, 120 grit, softened the work of the first. The boards lost their splinters. Their grain began to show in long, wavering lines, like water held still. The third pass, 220, was not strictly necessary for a floor that had survived a century of boots, but she did it in the front room, where customers' hands might one day rest on the counter and eyes might lower toward the boards while waiting. 3 passes. 80. 120. 220. Her knees bruised. Her wrists ached from guiding the machine. Dust entered the seams of her clothes and made a pale mask at her hairline. At night, when she blew her nose, the cloth came away gray. For finish, she chose oil instead of varnish. Mr. Bell had tung oil in a dented can and boiled linseed oil in another, both old enough that he tested them before letting her carry them home. She mixed carefully, thinning the first coat so it would enter the wood rather than sit on top pretending. With a lint-free rag cut from one of the ruined shirts, she worked oil into each plank by hand, rubbing with the grain until the floor drank and refused more. The color changed slowly. Dark honey first. Then, after the second coat, deeper amber. By the third, after 48 hours of cure between applications, the heartwood in several boards turned almost mahogany, not red like furniture in a grand room, but brown-red like leaves under ice. The worn path in the front room remained visible. The old stains did not disappear. They settled into the finish as part of the record. One morning during the curing days, she woke with no will in her body. It was not sickness. It was not a decision. The stove needed tending. The bucket needed emptying. The ledger needed numbers. And the kitchen floor waited for its final rubbing. She put one foot to the floor and then sat there on the edge of the blanket, unable to begin the small ceremony of standing. Outside, the morning was blue with cold, the kind of blue that makes trees look farther away. She fed the stove, drank water, put on her boots, and walked past the walnut lane without tools. She followed the road toward the marsh, where low grass showed through snow and cattails stood broken at their tops. The water there lay half frozen, half open, reflecting a pale sky. She sat on a flat stone near the edge with her coat pulled around her knees. A great blue heron stood in the shallows that should have been too cold for any living patience. It did not fish. It did not move except when wind passed through its feathers. Its long neck folded into itself. Its legs, thin as reeds, disappeared into black water. Nora watched it for a long time, long enough for the sun to lift above the trees and find blue in the bird's back, gray in its wings, a blade of white along its face. She did no work that day. Near noon, snowmelt began to drip from the cattails. In the distance, a truck crossed a bridge. The heron took one careful step, waited, then another. It seemed neither idle nor busy. It was simply alive in a hard season, spending no motion it did not need. When Nora returned to the forge near dusk, the floor remained unfinished and did not accuse her. The next morning, she rubbed the final coat until her hands warmed from friction. Midway through the front room, when sunlight moved across the boards and caught the old path from door to counter, she stopped with the rag in her hand. The forge was not empty. It had only been waiting. February began with glass. There were 8 windows in the cottage and forged together, if one counted the small loft sash with one pane missing and the fixed transom above the front door. 3 had no glass at all. 4 were cracked in ways that let wind speak through them. 1, on the east wall of the front room, was original, or as near to original as anything in the building could claim without papers. Its wavy glass bent the walnut trees into soft, uneven shapes, and in one corner someone had scratched 1788 so lightly that it appeared only when morning light passed through at an angle. She decided not to replace that pane. Mr. Bell approved by saying nothing for several seconds. "Good," he said at last. "A house should keep one eye from its youth." The other windows required the humbler courage of repair. He sold her salvage glass from storm windows stacked in his storage room, each piece wrapped in newspaper. Dapther 3 glazing putty came in a small tub with a lid that fought being opened. Glazing points came in a packet light enough to lose in a pocket. For the windows whose sashes would not stay open, he cut a length of 1/4-inch cotton sash cord and showed her the figure-8 knot twice, first slowly and then without mercy. The knot must be larger than the hole and smaller than your impatience. She carried the glass home under her arm like a stack of thin ice. The first sash came out reluctantly. Paint had sealed it into the frame, and old putty clung to the rabbets in hard gray ridges. She softened what she could with warmth, scraped the rest with a putty knife, and learned that forcing a corner was an easy way to crack wood she could not replace. Each pane had to be bedded in a thin cushion of putty, pressed just enough to seat, held with glazing points, pushed flat into the sash with the knife edge, then faced with a clean bevel of putty drawn from corner to corner. Her first bevel looked like a tired rope. She scraped it out and tried again. By the third window, her hand had learned the pressure. Too light, and the putty dragged. Too heavy, and it bulged against the glass. The knife had to travel at a steady angle, leaving a slope that would shed water and hide the points. Corners were not stabbed closed. They were folded, trimmed, and smoothed with a thumb dipped lightly in linseed oil. Cold made the putty stiff. Heat made it slump. February offered both within the same afternoon. For the sashes with weights, she opened the narrow pockets in the jambs and found cast-iron counterweights resting at the bottom like forgotten plumb bobs. The old cords had broken long ago, their ends frayed and blackened. She tied new cotton cord through the weight eye, set the figure-8 knot firmly, ran the cord over the pulley, and tied the other end into the sash groove. The first time she lifted the repaired sash and it stayed, she laughed once under her breath, a sound so brief it seemed to surprise the room more than herself. The transom was the most delicate. She worked from a crate, neck bent, using the smallest glass piece. Outside, the lane lay brown and white between walnut trunks. Inside, the front room held the smell of linseed oil, putty, and floor finish curing into something like a future. The original east pane she cleaned with vinegar and newspaper until the wavy glass gave back the morning. She left the scratched numbers untouched. Around that pane, the putty had failed in 2 places, but the glass still held. She packed new putty around it with the care of someone dressing an old wound without pretending to make the skin young. The last window was in the kitchen. It had faced the south walnut all this time through cloth and broken edges. When she removed the rags, a gust entered the room and lifted ash from the stovetop. She scraped, bedded, set the pane, pushed the points, and drew the final putty bevel while late light moved through the branches outside. A chickadee landed on a walnut twig just beyond the new glass. It was so close she could see the black cap, the round body puffed against cold, the minute grip of its feet on bark. The bird tipped its head toward the room, not startled, not trusting, only present. For 3 breaths, they regarded each other through the repaired pane. Then it flicked away into the branches. Nora rested the putty knife on the sill and looked at the window holding winter outside. It was still a poor window by the standards of houses that had never been abandoned. The sash was scarred. The paint was uneven. The glass came from another home and carried faint scratches from a life before this one. but the wind no longer crossed the kitchen as if it owned the place. That evening, she lit the stove, washed the putty from her fingers with yellow soap, and sat on the floorboards that had cured to their deep, hand-worn shine. Snowmelt ran down the lane in narrow tracks. The roof shed it. The chimney carried smoke. The windows held. For the first time, the work she had done did not feel like defense. It felt like a beginning with tools still laid out for morning. By late February, the walls began asking for a gentler hand. The roof had stopped admitting weather from above. The windows had made wind choose proper entrances, and the chimney had learned again how to carry smoke without complaint. Once those louder injuries had been addressed, the plaster could be seen for what it was, not decoration, not smoothness for its own sake, but skin over bone, a patient covering laid by workers who expected a room to hold warmth. The original plaster remained on hand-split oak lath, narrow strips split by grain rather than sawn, their faces uneven beneath the hardened coats. In places where the finish coat had chipped away, Nora could see horsehair curled in the lime like dark threads caught in frozen milk. It had held through seasons of neglect because someone had mixed it properly, pressed it through the lath with care, and allowed each coat time to become itself. 3 patches had failed near the chimney. The first was in the kitchen, above the stovepipe, where past leaks had loosened the plaster until it bowed outward in a shallow belly. The second was in the front room, beside the bricked fireplace, where a crack ran from lintel to ceiling and widened enough for dust to gather. The third was in the forge, close to the hood, where heat, soot, and water had made the wall powder under her hand. She did not tear down what still held. She tested with her knuckles, listening for hollow sound, and marked only what had already separated. The loose plaster came away in careful pieces, revealing oak lath beneath, dry in some spots, punky in others, but mostly sound. Where a strip had split, she cut a patch from salvaged oak and nailed it with small cut nails, leaving gaps so the new plaster could push through and form keys on the back. Mr. Bell had, in the rear of his store, a paper sack of horsehair plaster fiber from the 1950s, left from his father's time and tied at the top with binder twine. "I have kept this too long," he said. "Then you should keep it. I have kept it long enough to know where it belonged." He would not sell the whole sack. He measured what she needed into a brown paper bag, then added lime, sand, and instruction enough to make the walk home heavier than the materials. For the scratch coat, 1 part lime putty, 2½ parts sharp sand, horsehair teased loose and mixed until the trowel lifted little dark fibers without clumping. For the brown coat, similar but stiffer, built out to 3/8 of an inch and allowed 72 hours to set before finish. For the finish coat, lime, fine sand, and patience, 1/8 inch only, not spread thick to hide unevenness. The first coat was awkward. She dampened the old lath with a brush, waited until the shine left the wood, then pressed the scratch coat in with a hawk and trowel borrowed from Silas Mercer. It had to be pushed, not merely spread, forced through the gaps so it mushroomed behind the lath and held when cured. The wall resisted. Plaster slid once onto her boot. She gathered it back, added a little sand, and tried again. When the patch was covered, she scored it with a scrap of lath in diagonal lines, shallow enough not to cut through, deep enough to give the next coat a grip. It looked rough, almost ugly, and that roughness was proper. Hidden work often is. 72 hours taught waiting all over again. During those days, she did other things that did not shake the wall, mending a shelf, sweeping the forge bricks, washing jars, oiling the newly found tools, and writing each expense in the ledger. She touched the plaster only with the back of one finger near an edge, testing coolness, then resistance. The patch lightened as it cured. The horsehair disappeared into the lime, doing its unseen labor. The brown coat filled the depth, brought the patch nearly flush with the old wall, and required a truer eye. She used a straight board as a derby, dragging it across to find hollows. She filled low places, shaved high places, and left the surface slightly open for the finish. Again, 72 hours. Again, the house asking for no hurry. For the finish coat, she mixed less than she wanted, because overmixing had punished her before. The trowel moved differently then, not forcing but laying, smoothing, feathering the edges into the aged plaster around it. New lime met old lime. The line remained faintly visible if a person looked with a repairer's eye, but it did not shout. By evening, the three patches held light. They were not perfect in the way new walls in new rooms are perfect. They had small waves, a trowel line at one corner, and a place near the chimney where the old surface dipped lower than the patch could honor. But when she pressed her palm against the kitchen wall beside the stovepipe, nothing shifted. These patches will hold another 100 years. She did not say it aloud. The room did not require a witness beyond the hand. Doris from the cafe began leaving paper bags on the rear step before March had settled on whether it meant to be winter or spring. At first, Nora assumed the bags had been delivered by mistake. The first held 2-day-old rolls, one bruised apple, and a paper cup of soup wrapped in a towel. The second held bread heels, a boiled egg, and a wedge of cheddar too dry for the lunch counter but too good for the bin. The third held coffee grounds in a folded packet, not enough for a pot by cafe standards, but enough to darken water and warm a morning. Nora carried the third bag back to Main Street's Market and Cafe, where Doris stood behind the counter in a blue apron dusted with flour. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s, with hair pinned high by 2 pencils and forearms strong from lifting trays. Her face had the plain composure of someone who had seen hunger enter through many doors and had learned not to shame it. "You left this," Nora said. Doris wiped her hands on her apron. "I did."
"I cannot keep taking food without paying."
"Then don't call it food." Nora held the bag out. Doris did not take it. She turned to slide a tray of biscuits into the case, then looked over her shoulder. "Call it inventory moving in the right direction. That is still payment owed." "Fine," Doris said. "In candles when the shop reopens." The words were impossible enough to make the air between them still. "I do not make candles. You have beeswax, don't you?" Nora's hand tightened around the bag. Doris saw too much and said less than she saw. "Then spoons. Or polishing. Or one of those little dishes people put earrings in and pretend they don't need. I am not particular. The shop is not open. Not today." There was no argument in the tone. Only a shelf, placed at some future height, where a debt could stand without humiliating either side. After that, Doris did not leave bags every day. That would have made it charity with a schedule. She left them when weather turned hard, when the cafe had more soup than lunch, when a loaf split badly along the side, when someone canceled a pie order. Sometimes the bag held a note written on the back of a receipt. Too salty for customers. Fine for people with sense. Sometimes there was no note at all. Nora began saving every bit of brown paper and twine. She washed the soup cups, dried them on the shelf, and used them for sorting nails, glazing points, screws, and tiny fragments of glass lifted from floor cracks. Repayment would not come quickly, but the account existed. Doris had given it a name. Caleb arrived on a Saturday with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars of a red Schwinn bicycle. He was 15, perhaps 16, narrow as a lath, with ears reddened by cold and a cap pulled low over hair the color of straw. His coat sleeves were too short. The bicycle had chrome fenders pocked with rust, a playing card clipped near the rear wheel, and a milk crate wired over the back tire. In the crate were work gloves, a thermos, and 2 apples. Nora had been hauling fallen walnut limbs from the edge of the lane, separating what could be cut for stove wood from what had gone punky. The saw work was slow. The splitting slower. Walnut does not yield like soft pine. Each round held twisted grain in the memory of storms. The boy leaned the Schwinn against the stone wall. My mother said to come. Nora straightened, one hand on the saw handle. Who is your Mrs. Bell's niece. The one from Bedford. That did not clarify enough, but the boy had already taken up the maul. I cannot pay you. My mother said. He said a round upright. Said what? He swung. The maul struck off center, sank, held. He rocked it free with embarrassment hidden under effort. About your grandfather. Nora looked toward him then. He did not look back. He set the round again, adjusted his feet, and swung better. The wood opened with a wet crack. 2 halves fell away into snow. He picked up 1 half and set it for quartering. He fixed her teapot, Caleb said. No charge. When my father left. The sentence stood there in the cold yard, small and complete. Nora picked up one of the split pieces and carried it to the stack by the rear door. Caleb worked for 2 hours without asking to come inside, though his hands reddened around the gloves and his breath came hard. When she brought out coffee thinned with hot water in one of Doris's rolls, he drank the coffee with a grimace he tried to hide and ate the roll in 3 bites. At noon, she took 2 folded bills from her pocket. He stepped back at once. No. Mom. My mother said not to. Your mother is not. He lifted them all again and pointed it toward the woodpile, which might have been insolence from another boy, but from him was only refusal made awkward by youth. She said if I took money, I couldn't come back. So he came back. Not every day. School and chores claimed him. But on Saturdays, and once on a Wednesday afternoon after an early dismissal, the red Schwinn appeared against the wall. He split wood, carried bricks, held boards, hauled ashes, and once spent an hour retrieving a sash cord that had slipped into a wall pocket because Nora's knot had been less exact than she believed. He spoke little unless spoken to. When he laughed, it came suddenly and left quickly, as if laughter in him still expected correction. Reverend Boyd walked past every morning after the ice left the lane. He was pastor of a church nearer town, though Nora did not attend and he did not ask why. He was tall, stooped at the neck, with a black wool coat brushed thin at the cuffs and a hat he tipped to every living thing with equal seriousness. Nora! The walnut trees, the dog from the neighboring farm, once even the chickadee when it startled up from the pump handle. The first week, he only passed. The second week, he paused at the lane and said, "Morning." The third week, he stood by the stone wall while Nora carried a pail of ashes to the low place beyond the sumac. Smoke draws well now. Yes, sir. Glad. He had a voice suited to rooms where grief sat in the back pew and did not wish to be named. On mornings when the fog lay low, he seemed to appear from it without arrival. On clear mornings, she could see him from the kitchen window before he reached the lane, walking with a cane that struck gravel in a 2-beat rhythm. He never offered advice about repairs. He never asked about money. He never told her that hardship improved the soul, which made her trust him more than she expected. One morning in March, when frost still whitened the grass and her hands were swollen from plaster work, he stopped near the pump and removed his hat. "For keeping hands steady," he said. 4 words. Then he replaced the hat and continued walking. The prayer remained after him in the yard, not floating, not glowing, not doing any of the grand things people sometimes assign to prayer. It simply stayed the way breath stays on a cold pane for a moment before fading. Nora did not know what she believed about heaven listening, but she understood the kindness of a man asking quietly and walking on without demanding gratitude. By then the forge had begun gathering names without opening its door. Doris, Caleb, Boyd, Bell, Mercer, Hatch. Each person came no farther than the work allowed, left no claim behind, and went on with their own lives. That was what made the help bearable. No one tried to own her recovery by witnessing it. The lane kept their footprints until thaw erased them. The cellar waited until February 11th because everything beneath the house should be approached after the roof has stopped lying. Nora had known about the door since her second day. It sat in the forge floor behind the hearth, square of planks, banded with iron straps, half covered by broken crates and 2 sacks of coal gone to dust. She had cleared around it in January, then left it alone. A cellar can hold water, animals, rot, gases, collapsed stone, and all the old darkness a building has not yet spent. It deserved mourning, a lantern, rope, and another person within shouting distance. Caleb came that day, though it was not Saturday. Mr. Bell had sent him with a coil of rope, 2 candles, and instructions to stand at the top and not be heroic. The cellar door lifted with a groan from hinges that had not moved in decades. Cold air came up first, deeper than the room's cold, smelling of stone, earth, damp iron, and something mineral that belonged underground. Nora tied the rope around the iron ring in the door, wedged the door open with a brick, and lowered the lantern first. 7 granite steps descended into dark. They were narrow, worn in the middle, and green near the edges where damp had fed a thin skin of life. She tested each with the broom handle before placing a boot. Caleb stood above, both hands on the rope, though the rope was not tied to her. "Say something if you fall," he said. "If I fall, you will know." "Yes." "Mom." The cellar measured 12 feet by 15, fieldstone walls on 3 sides, foundation stones larger at the corners, and a low ceiling held by oak beams blackened with age. The floor was not dirt, as she had expected, but laid fieldstone, uneven yet deliberate, with a shallow channel cut toward a drain in the east corner. No standing water. No animals besides 1 dead mouse dried to almost nothing beneath a shelf. Along the north wall, narrow racks still held bottle shapes in dust. Along the west, a work shelf had collapsed under jars of hardened tallow and scraps of lead she would not touch without gloves. At the center of the floor lay a single-dressed granite slab. It was not like the surrounding stone. It had been cut square, 3 feet by 4, smoothed on top, and set flush with the fieldstone around it. Near one corner, barely visible under dust, was a carved craft mark, the fiddlehead inside a circle. The cut was not deep, but it was exact. Whoever had made it had meant the mark to last without drawing careless attention. Nora stood over it with the lantern lowered. Caleb leaned down from above. "What is it?" "Stone." I can see that. A deliberate one. Are you lift? The answer came before curiosity could dress itself as courage. She did not know what lay under the slab. A cistern, a dry well, a storage hollow, bones of some animal. Nothing at all. But the house had already opened one hidden place, and that opening had nearly overwhelmed the room. Not every secret must be claimed the first season. Some are safer when allowed to remain in the floor until the person above them has become steadier. She swept the slab clean enough to see the mark, then covered it again with 2 boards laid loosely, not hiding it from herself, only protecting it from falling mortar or dropped tools. On the stairs going up, the 3rd step shifted under her hand. Not underfoot. In the side, where the granite tread met the fieldstone wall, a wedge of darkness showed behind it. She held the lantern closer and saw that a small oak box had been fitted beneath the lip of the step, invisible from above, kept in place by 2 handmade pegs. The wood had swollen, but not rotted. She worked the pegs free with the awl and eased the box out slowly. It fit in both hands. Upstairs, Caleb hovered beside the hearth, trying not to hover. Is it money? No. You don't know. I know its weight. The box was light, and money has a particular silence when much of it is enclosed. She set it on the bench, brushed off dust, and lifted the lid. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph wrapped in a square of linen. The key was small but finely made, its bow shaped like the fiddlehead mark, curl within curl. The brass darkened nearly brown except where it had rubbed against the cloth. Its bit was unusual. Not a house key, not a cabinet key, but something made for a private plate or fitted lock. Nora turned it in the light and saw tiny file marks along the stem. The photograph had darkened at the edges, but the image remained clear enough to stop both of them. A young woman stood in front of the cottage when the clapboards were white, the sign legible, the windows whole. She wore a high-necked blouse, a dark skirt, and an apron tied firmly at the waist. Her hair was pinned up in a practical knot. In one hand she held a slender ladle. In the other, a finished porringer whose fiddlehead ear caught a pale glint from the sun. Her face was not Nora's exactly. The jaw was narrower, the mouth fuller, the eyes set under heavier brows. But the resemblance crossed the years without asking permission. It was there in the steady way she looked at the camera, in the length of the fingers holding the ladle, in the inward composure that did not soften for being young. Caleb looked from the photograph to Nora, then back again. She looks like you. Nora did not answer. On the back, in faded ink, was written, Clara Vale, daughter of Silas Vale, age 25, summer of 1903. Daughter of Silas. Not founder of the building, perhaps, but founder of the branch of work Ruth had preserved in patterns and names. A daughter standing before the forge with a tool in her hand, recorded not as helper, not as wife, not as someone beside the maker, but as herself. Nora placed the photograph beside the letter that had given women back their share of the trade. The brass key she set on the mantel above the bricked fireplace in the front room. There was no lock in the building it fit, not one she had found. She tried the front door, the rear cupboard, the tool chest, the tin box, the cellar door band, and the old cabinet beneath the counter. Nothing. The key turned nowhere. So it stayed on the mantel, catching light when afternoon reached the front room. Caleb studied it before leaving. What if it opened something important? Then it can... He considered that with the seriousness of a boy who had not yet forgiven all adults for rushing him. Most people would try hard. Most people break things. He nodded once, as if the answer had entered some private ledger. After he left, Nora returned to the cellar door and looked down into the dark where the granite slab lay covered but not forgotten. The house had given another sign. Not a treasure this time. Not money. Not instructions. But resemblance. That, too, could unsettle a person. A face crossing a century can feel like being called by a name no one has spoken aloud. She closed the cellar door, set the iron latch, and placed the oak box on the workbench. The photograph went into the tin box with the letter. The key remained where light could find it. On certain afternoons, when the sun passed through the wavy east pane, the bow shaped like a fiddlehead cast a small curled shadow against the plaster. Nora did not yet know what had opened. By March, the snow retreated in tatters. It left first from the south side of the stone wall, then from the lane ruts, then from the ring around the walnut trunks where sun-warmed bark and bark-warmed air. The yard emerged in patches, flattened grass, black husks, broken brick, a lost hinge, a shard of blue bottle glass near the well. Mud took over where snow withdrew, thick and brown and honest enough to show every footprint. The creek beyond the sumac grew loud with snowmelt. All winter it had slipped under ice in a patient murmur, but now it ran hard over stones, carrying leaves, twigs, and the loosened earth of fields upstream. At night, with the rear door closed and the stove low, Nora could hear it through the repaired window, a steady rushing beneath the small sounds of the house. Water moving, frost leaving, the ground returning to itself. Walnut catkins appeared in April, soft and green, hanging from branches that had looked dead 2 weeks before. The chickadee came back to the kitchen window, then brought another. Crows inspected the chimney and disapproved of its reduced hospitality. A fox crossed the lane one morning with a limp gray mouse in its mouth and glanced toward the forge without slowing. Work changed with the light. The emergencies had diminished, not ended. A building like that never becomes done in any final sense. But spring altered the questions. Instead of asking what must be prevented before nightfall, the rooms began to ask what should be prepared with care. Shelves could be leveled. The front counter could be scraped and oiled. The sign hooks could be cleaned. The forge bench could be strengthened beneath its sag. The patterns could be studied without the pressure of cold entering through every crack. Many people, given tools and hidden money and a trade sleeping in the next room, might have begun at once. Nora did not. She knew enough to understand that a craft resurrected too quickly becomes performance. The alloys Ruth described were exact, but exact words were not the same as ready hands. The old ladle needed cleaning. The molds needed inspection for cracks, warping, vent lines, and pins. The hood needed a better smoke test under heat. The crucibles had to be proved empty of fractures. The workbench needed shoring. The floor around the hearth needed leveling so a person carrying molten metal would not discover a loose brick with a full ladle in hand. And she needed to eat regularly enough that her hands did not tremble. So she made a decision as deliberate as any pour. She would not begin the pewter work that spring. She would order a small amount of new tin with 1 coin from the cache. 1 ordinary coin, not one wrapped with memory or marked by a careful hand. She would practice on samples no larger than buttons, then on plain discs, then on a spoon bowl if the first 20 failures taught her properly. She would not open the front room to customers because a repaired building is not the same as a ready shop. She would not sell what she could not stand behind. In the ledger, beneath the accounts for roof, chimney, floor, plaster, and food, She wrote a new heading. Practice metal. Not production. The word practice steadied her. April rain washed the yard clean. Grass came pale at first, then brightened. The repaired windows blurred under water and cleared when the clouds passed. Doris sent fewer bags because there were fewer hard days. But when she did, the bags held spring things, the green tops of scallions, 2 eggs, rhubarb trimmed from behind the cafe. Caleb came with his Schwinn wheels, splashing through mud, and helped move bricks away from the south wall. Reverend Boyd passed without hat on warmer mornings and still tipped his head to the trees. Inside, the rooms no longer smelled first of abandonment. They smelled of stove warmth, oil, lime, wood dust, coffee, old metal, and rain drying from boots. One evening, after sanding the front counter until the grooves showed clean, Nora stood in the doorway between the customer room and the forge. Light came through the wavy pane, crossed the mantel where the brass key waited, and reached the covered molds on the rear bench. Dust floated in it. Not neglect now. Ordinary dust. Living dust. The kind that returns no matter how faithfully a person sweeps. She rested both hands on the doorframe. The house was patient. So was she. 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first finished piece cooled on the rear bench under a square of linen. It was not elaborate. No ornament, no raised angel, no proud family crest. A small porringer, plain bowled, with a single fiddlehead ear shaped from the recovered pattern and chased only enough to bring the curl into clarity. The alloy had been measured 3 times, tin bright and clean, antimony weighed on a small scale, copper shaved fine and added last. She had kept the melt below the yellowing point, skimmed twice, warmed the mold until beeswax smoked in a thin blue line, and poured in one motion without letting the ladle kiss the gate. The first casting had failed in October, cold shut near the rim. She marked it, filed the flaw open, and kept the piece on the shelf where mistakes could teach without being hidden. The second had trapped a small bubble near the ear. The third tore at the throat when she filed the outside too soon, exactly as the letter had warned. She kept that one too. The fourth had come whole. For 3 days she did not polish it beyond what was necessary. She let it sit on the bench while she worked around it, the way one lets bread cool before cutting. Then, on a morning when snow made the windows glow and the stovepipe hummed faintly with draught, she took rotten stone and oil, a linen rag, and the fine agate burnisher. The surface came up slowly. Not mirror, not factory shine. A softened gray luster with depth inside it, like winter sky reflected in a well bucket. At the underside of the foot, she struck the craft mark with a tiny die she had made from tool steel under Mr. Bell supervision. The fiddlehead inside a circle. Beneath it, smaller, the year. She held the porringer in both hands afterward, feeling the weight settle into her palms. It did not change the world. That was its dignity. The interior of the forge by then had become modestly whole. The kitchen walls were lime-washed, not bright, but clean enough to gather mourning. The stove had a fitted replacement lid, found in a salvage yard in May, blacked and polished until it looked as if it had always belonged. Shelves held jars of barley, beans, tea, lamp wicks, glazing points, and nails sorted into cups. A braided rug lay beside the stove, made from worn shirts and scrap wool, uneven at one edge because Caleb had helped and refused to redo his part. The front room held the oiled counter, 2 chairs, a narrow shelf for finished repairs, and the iron candlestick with the beeswax candle remnant kept beside it. The bricked fireplace remained bricked. She had learned that not everything closed by a previous life must be reopened for appearance. Above it, on the mantel, sat the brass key, the tintype photograph in a plain frame, and the metal wrapped in blue cloth except on certain days. The forge room had changed least, which made it changed most honestly. The bench had been braced from beneath. The hearth had been repaired but not beautified. The hood drew. The tools hung on pegs by shape and use. Molds rested under clean cloths. A ledger sat in a drawer, not hidden, with accounts, temperatures, failed pours, customer names, and one page labeled kindnesses, though no one else had seen that heading. The cellar remained mostly undisturbed. She had swept the stairs, shored one beam, and kept lime from falling through the floorboards above. The dressed granite slab still lay at the center, covered loosely by boards. Some mornings, curiosity stood beside her at the cellar door with its coat on, ready to go down. She let it stand. There was enough work above ground. The brass key revealed itself in the second winter, not by searching but by the plain accident of weather. A storm came through on January 12th with wet snow and wind from the southeast. By morning, one large limb had come down from the south walnut, not the limb that held the horseshoe, but one above it that tore bark as it fell. The damage exposed a section of trunk where the tree had grown over something flat. At first Nora thought it was another bit of iron, perhaps part of an old hinge or a plate nailed there to hold wire. Then afternoon light struck the wound and showed brass under bark. She fetched the small pruning saw and worked only what had already torn loose. The tree had folded itself around a brass plate no larger than her palm, greened at the edges, fitted into an old hollow, and nearly swallowed. In the center of the plate was a keyhole shaped unlike any on a door. The key from the mantel entered without effort. It turned once, softly. A narrow brass face opened outward from the tree. Not a drawer exactly, but a shallow weatherproof compartment lined in tin. The walnut had grown around it so long that wood and metal seemed to have made a private agreement. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a folded 48-star flag in a small envelope darkened by age. She carried both to the kitchen before opening them. The flag was small, perhaps meant for a grave or window, its cotton faded but intact. 48 stars sat in even rows on a blue field gone soft with years. Along one edge, a narrow strip had been mended by hand and thread, slightly darker than the cloth. The envelope contained a note. June 6, 1944. If this tree still stands, let the flag remain with the house until someone has a hand steady enough to take it down. I have folded it here because the radio today speaks of France again, and I cannot bear to hear the name of that country without thinking of all we have already given it. Thomas carried a larger flag under his coat when he marched in 1917, folded by his mother, Adeline Whitcomb. He brought back only the habit of touching his breast pocket when church bells rang. This small one flew in the front window when the telegrams began coming to town again. Whoever finds it, do not wave it for pride. Carry it for remembering. Ruth A. V. Whitcomb. Nora read the date twice. The old war named in the medal, and the later war moving through the radio while a woman in the forge listened from a continent away, had met inside a tree. Not as glory, as cloth, as dread, as the careful folding of what could not be mended by hands alone. On November 11 of that same year, she took the medal to Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. The morning was cold and clear, with oak leaves gathered along the paths and frost silvering the lower grass. She had written ahead to the cemetery office, not to arrange ceremony, but to ask where the Whitcomb and Vale stones lay, if they lay there at all. A volunteer had found a family plot beneath pines not far from Author's Ridge. Though the stone for Thomas was modest and weather-softened, his name still legible if touched with light from the side. She did not polish the metal. She did not pin it anywhere. She unwrapped it from the blue cloth and set it on the stone while church bells in town marked the 11th hour of the 11th day. There were other people in the cemetery, some near veterans' graves, some walking dogs, some only passing through. No one came over. That was right. She stood with her hands folded and let the bronze rest where a name had waited. Afterward, she wrapped the metal again and brought it home. Honoring did not require surrendering. Some things belong both to the dead and to the keeping place that remembers them. The money remained mostly where it had been placed. In the first winter, she had spent 3 coins, 1 common silver dime toward practice tin, 1 worn quarter toward glass, and 1 Franklin half when the stove lid from the salvage yard had to be purchased before another buyer took it. In the second year, she spent 1 more dime on a packet of proper polishing compound after discovering the old cake had gone gritty beyond rescue. She recorded each coin by denomination, condition, and use, then folded the empty paper back into the tin box. The bills she did not touch except when repair required time she could not otherwise buy. Even then, she converted only what was needed and kept the receipts in the ledger. No grand furniture came. No motor car. No dresses beyond work clothing. No sign painted with gold leaf. The cash had not become display. It had become roof, mortar, glass, food, coal, insurance, a building permit, and the right to refuse hurry. The remaining coins stayed sealed for the next one. That phrase entered her slowly. At first it meant no one in particular. A future repairer. A child not born. A stranger who might come after law. Weather or grief had done what they do to houses and people. Then it began to mean someone more definite without acquiring a face. The next one would need instructions. Not only where money was hidden, but what it was for. Not only how to melt alloy, but how to survive the first night in a building that did not yet trust you. By the second winter, the shop had quietly reopened without an opening. Doris was responsible, though she denied responsibility with a face so exact that no one believed her. On the cafe corkboard, between a notice for piano lessons and a lost orange cat, an index card appeared in blue ink. Pewter repairs. Spoons. Cups. Small family pieces. Quiet work. Careful polish. Leave name with Doris. No address. No boast. No promise of speed. The first customer was a woman from Acton with a dented baby cup wrapped in a dish towel. She had found the card while buying coffee and had carried the cup in her car for 9 days before asking Doris whether the person who did pewter was kind. Doris told her kindness was not listed on the card, but accuracy was. Nora repaired the cup by raising the dent slowly from the inside, annealing nothing because the metal did not require it, polishing only where the tool marks needed softening, and leaving the old scratches around the rim because a child had made some of them with teeth. The woman cried when she saw it, not loudly, not in a way that asked to be comforted. She only placed 2 fingers over her mouth and nodded. After that came a spoon with a twisted handle, a candlestick with a bent socket, a plate blackened by fire, 3 buttons from an old coat, a porringer whose owner wanted it polished brighter than Nora thought wise and accepted the explanation when it came. Names entered the ledger. Payment entered slowly. Some paid cash. Some paid with barter. Doris delivered 2 repairs back through the cafe and collected envelopes in a coffee tin beneath the counter. By December, the mailing list held 43 names. It was not called a mailing list at first. It was just people who wanted to be told if she ever made new pieces. Doris wrote names on receipt backs until Mr. Bell gave Nora a ruled notebook and told her civilization had invented columns for a reason. She made columns. Name, town, object, contact, notes. Under notes, she wrote things that mattered. Wants mother's spoon left dull. Cannot lift heavy lid. Son getting married. Nervous about cost. Likes plain work. The list did not make her famous. It made her responsible. One afternoon near Christmas, Caleb returned with a wooden sign tied across the handlebars of the Schwinn, though by then the bicycle looked too small for him. He had grown taller, shoulders beginning to broaden, wrists showing from sleeves again. The sign was wrapped in burlap and tied with twine so tightly that it took both of them to free it. He had carved it himself in shop class and finished it in his grandfather's garage. The wood was pine, not fancy, but sanded smooth. The letters were hand-cut and uneven in a way that made them human. At the top, in larger letters, it read Vale Pewter. Beneath that, in smaller letters, repairs and handwork. And at the bottom, after a line he had cut with a V-gouge and darkened with stain, were two words that made the room grow very still. And daughters, plural. Nora looked at the sign for so long that Caleb began explaining too quickly. I know it was maybe not the official name. Mr. Bell said signs should not lie, and Doris said signs should not ask permission from dead men only. And I saw the photograph, and the letter said women did the accounts and polishing and all that. So I thought maybe daughters. Not one daughter. More like all of them. But if you hate it, I can sand it down. She touched the lower letters. The carved edges were not perfect. A corner of the ampersand had chipped and been filled. The S leaned very slightly uphill. He had worked around the flaw instead of beginning again, and somehow that made the sign better. I do not hate it. He stopped moving. Where should it go? They hung it inside first, above the counter, because exterior weather would require more oil and a proper bracket. Caleb held the ladder. Nora marked the holes. Mr. Bell had given brass screws for the purpose, and pretended not to know when they vanished from his inventory. The sign settled against the wall as if it had been absent. Not new. When Doris saw it the next day, she stood with arms folded and said, "Took long enough for the truth to get painted. It is carved. Then it took long." Reverend Boyd, passing that week, tipped his hat to the sign through the front window before tipping it to Nora. Silas Mercer came once in January to inspect the roof without being asked and stood beneath the sign with his hands behind his back. "Letters shed water," he said. "They are inside. I mean the kind that gets into families." For him, it was almost a sermon. That winter, after the first porringer cooled and the sign found its place, Nora began writing her own letter. She did not begin with instructions. Instructions can become a hiding place for the heart if written too soon. She began by clearing the kitchen table, sharpening a pencil with her father's old pocket knife, and laying out paper thick enough to survive folding. The first sheet remained blank for an hour while snow moved down the window in small, slanting lines. Then she wrote the opening words exactly as they had once been written to her. "My dear one, whoever you are." She stopped there. The pencil rested in her hand. The stove ticked. Outside, the south walnut held its scar where the brass plate had opened. Now sealed again, the little flag and note moved indoors to the tin box because weather had done its part and did not need to be asked for more. The horseshoe remained in the bark. The creek ran under ice. The lane showed 2 sets of tracks, her own and Caleb's. On the second line, she wrote not about money, not yet, but about the first night on the floor and how a deed can feel like shelter before a roof does. She wrote about reading manuals until fear became steps. She wrote that fire should never be flattered. She wrote that a person should eat before counting money and sleep before opening letters if the body has reached its limit. She wrote that hidden things do not become gifts until they are received with order. She left room for temperatures, ratios, and mistakes. On another page, she began a list of what she had learned that Ruth had not needed to say. How to speak with county clerks. How to accept credit without surrendering dignity. How to tell a proud nail by sight and a softboard by sound. How to let a bad morning pass at the marsh. How to refuse spectacle. How to keep coins for a person whose name is not yet known. The letter took weeks because truth resisted being written in one weather. Sometimes she added only 1 sentence. Sometimes a page. Sometimes she crossed out a line that sounded too wise and replaced it with what had actually happened. She did not make herself kinder than she had been or braver than she had felt. A future inheritor would not need a saint. They would need a usable witness. In spring, she made a new cedar disc for the large mold chamber. The first one, the one she had lifted with trembling hands, she kept wrapped in linen inside the tin box. The new disc bore the fiddlehead mark and nothing else. Beneath it, in the sealed chamber, she placed copies of the lineage notes, her repair ledger's first pages, instructions for opening the cellar safely, and a smaller packet of money marked not for spending quickly but for time. The rest of what had been preserved before her remained in its careful order. She did not seal it fully yet. There were more years to live before a final closing. More mistakes to record. More pieces to make. More names to add to the list of kindnesses. On certain evenings, when work ended early and the light held, she sat behind the counter and listened to the rooms. The kitchen breathed stove warmth. The front room held the sign. The forge kept its tools in order. The cellar kept its stone. Outside, the walnut trees moved through seasons with the slow authority of things that do not ask whether they are useful. People came now, but not in crowds. A woman from Lincoln brought a communion plate wrapped in flannel. A widower from Maynard brought 2 spoons from his wife's drawer and asked whether dullness could be left because she had liked them that way. A young couple from Concord bought the 4th new porringer and did not ask for it to be engraved. Doris delivered envelopes. Mr. Bell criticized her nail storage. Caleb learned to file a sprue without rounding the edge. Reverend Boyd continued walking, though slower each year, and still gave the forward prayer when her hands shook from too much work. The forge waits. It has always waited. That was what she came to understand. And not only about the building. A trade can wait inside a tool roll, under a floorboard, behind a clerk's careful eyes. A kindness can wait in a paper bag, a hardware ledger, a boy's refusal to take money, a prayer spoken while walking on. A house can wait without bitterness if no one has taught it to expect applause. Even a person can wait inside herself, weathered and boarded over, until some patient hand removes the first nail. Near the end of that second winter, Mrs. Hatch sent a note by mail. It was written on town stationery, folded once, with no unnecessary words. She said the deed had been properly indexed, the demolition order formally retired, and the town records corrected to show an occupied repair shop at the old lane. At the bottom, below her signature, she had added a line in smaller handwriting. Your original payment remains in my desk drawer. Nora read the note twice and smiled in a way no one else saw. The $2 had not vanished into town accounting after all. They had not been sorted with permit fees, dog licenses, or photocopy charges. They remained where the clerk had placed them, folded and separate, not as charity and not as sentiment anyone would name aloud. Evidence, perhaps. A record of a door opened for the exact price asked. A reminder that sometimes a county headache is a house waiting for the correct hands. Nora placed Mrs. Hatch's note in the ledger under kindnesses. Then she went to the forge, lifted the clean cloth from the workbench, and began another small pour before the afternoon light left the windows. The mold warmed slowly. Beeswax smoked and did not flare. The metal gathered its bright skin. She skimmed once, waited, skimmed again, and lifted the ladle with both hands steady. Outside, the walnut branches held the last snow of the season. Inside, the pour entered the mold in one deliberate stream, silver and quiet, filling the waiting shape.